On the last night of the year 1853, a dinner table stands set inside the body of a dinosaur. Not a living one. It is a hollow shell of plaster and cement, cast in the shape of an Iguanodon, wide enough to seat a party of grown men within its curved flank. The place is Sydenham, on the southern edge of London, in the grounds where the great glass palace has been raised a second time. The winter air outside is cold and still. Inside the pale, unpainted casing, candle flames lean and steady, throwing long shadows up the arch of the ribs. A sculptor named Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins has arranged all of it. Around the table he has seated 21 guests, men of science and men of standing, gathered to raise a glass to a creature not one of them had ever seen alive. Not one of them could have. The last of the dinosaurs that were not birds died 66 million years ago, and the animal whose belly they are dining inside had walked the earth tens of millions of years before even that ending. These diners are the width of an ocean of time away from their subject, and still they feel sure enough of its shape to build it at full size and eat their supper inside it. Hold that image for a moment, because it is the beginning of a long climb. Stay with me, and you will watch guesswork give way to evidence slowly, across more than a century of patient looking. There is no rush here. We have deep time to cross, and we will cross it one bone at a time. Consider what these Victorian men actually knew. Very little, by the measure of anything we would call proof. The Iguanodon around them had been assembled in the mind from a scattering of fossil pieces, a few worn teeth, some broken limb bones, a heavy thigh, fragments of jaw. From those scraps, and from a great deal of confidence, they had conjured a whole animal. It is a remarkable thing to sit inside another creature's guess and call it a fact. That is very nearly what this dinner is. The man whose authority underwrites the whole enterprise is Sir Richard Owen, the most powerful anatomist in Britain. It is his reading of the bones that Hawkins is following as he shapes the wet plaster. Owen is a brilliant and difficult figure, a man who could look at a single fossil and describe the animal it came from with startling nerve. His word carries the weight of the nation's science, and so, when Owen pictures Iguanodon as a massive, heavy, four-footed beast, something like a scaled elephant crossed with a lizard, that is the shape that rises from the ground at Sydenham. The following year, in 1854, the finished models are unveiled to the public. There is nothing else like them anywhere in the world. For the first time, extinct animals are being shown not as flat drawings or loose bones in a case, but as full-size, solid, three-dimensional creatures, standing upright on their own legs in a landscape built for them. You could walk up to one and rest your hand on its flank. You could stand in its shadow and feel small. No one had ever been able to do that with a vanished world before. That is worth pausing on, because it is a genuine first, and the Victorians deserve the credit. Building an animal at life size forces you to answer questions a sketch lets you dodge. How thick was the neck? Where did the weight sit over the legs? How wide did the ribs sway? How did the whole mass balance and stand? Hawkins and Owen had to commit to every one of those answers in cement, in public, at full scale. It was an act of extraordinary ambition, and much of it was wrong. The most famous mistake sits quite literally on the animal's face. Among the scattered Iguanodon bones was a single cone of solid pointed material, roughly the size of a large thumb. Owen looked at that sharp cone and reasoned, not unreasonably, that it must be a horn, and that a horn belongs on the snout, and so the Sydenham Iguanodon wears a spike on its nose, like some heavy reptilian rhinoceros, staring out over the water with a weapon that was never there. We know now that the spike was no nose horn at all. It was a thumb. Later discoveries of far more complete skeletons showed that this cone of bone rode on the animal's hand, a stout defensive spike at the end of the forelimb. The Victorians had taken a thumb and planted it in the middle of the face. It is easy to smile at the error. It is more useful to understand why it was almost unavoidable. When you have one loose bone and no map of where it belongs, every guess is a coin toss dressed up as reason. That single misplaced spike is a small window onto a much larger problem. The men at that candlelit dinner were working very nearly blind. They had hard fossil bone, and precious little of it. And beyond the bone they had almost nothing. No skin, no soft outline, no sense of how the muscles hung on the frame, how the animal moved, what it weighed as it walked. Into that vast emptiness they poured imagination, and the imagination they reached for was the one they knew best, the world of living lizards and crocodiles scaled up to monstrous size. So their dinosaurs came out squat and slow and cold-blooded looking, bellies low, legs braced out to the sides or planted like pillars beneath them, sprawling giants, reptilian in the dullest sense. It was a reasonable picture, drawn from the closest living animals they could name, and it would take generations of new fossils to pull it apart. Much of what they built has since been overturned. Some of those heavy four-footed reconstructions belong, we now think, to animals that could rise and move on two legs, lighter and quicker than any Victorian dared to draw them. Here is the mystery that opens beneath this whole subject, the question the rest of our journey will answer piece by piece. How do you get from that? From a nose horn that was a thumb, from a lizard's slow guess poured into cement, all the way to what we can honestly claim today. Because today, for a small and growing number of these animals, we can speak about far more than the skeleton. We can describe the texture of the skin, in a few cases the actual colour, whether a body carried scales or bristles or true feathers, even in careful terms how fast the animal walked across soft ground. None of that is written on a bare bone. So where does it come from? How is any of it possible? This is the story I want to walk you through slowly, in the order the evidence itself allows. It is not a tale of one lucky discovery. It is a ladder, built rung by rung, and each rung had to hold weight before anyone could climb to the next. The men at the Sydenham dinner stood at the very bottom of it, in the dark with a handful of bones and a great deal of nerve. Everything above them had to be earned. Let me set out that ladder now so you can feel the shape of the climb before we begin it. The lowest and firmest rung is bone itself. Bone fossilizes readily. It is hard, mineral-rich, and built to survive. When an animal dies in the right place, buried quickly by mud or sand or ash, the bone can be turned slowly to stone, keeping its shape across tens of millions of years. That is why the Victorians had bones to argue over in the first place. Bone is the ground truth of this science, the part you can hold in your hand and measure with confidence. Almost everything else is inference stacked upon it. But bone alone is a bare frame. A skeleton propped in a museum hall is a coat rack, not an animal. To move up from the frame toward the living creature, you have to start reading the bone for clues about the things that did not survive. And here is the quiet miracle at the heart of modern paleontology. The soft parts leave marks on the hard parts. Muscle pulls on bone, and over a lifetime it roughens and ridges the surface where it anchors. Read those scars carefully and you can begin to rebuild the muscle that made them, and from the muscle, the true bulk and outline of the body. That is the next rung, and we will climb it in its turn. Above the muscle lies the skin, and above the skin, its texture and its colour, and its covering, whether scale or filament or feather. Each of those is a further step away from the certainty of bone, and each demands rarer and stranger kinds of fossil to reach. Skin almost never survives. When it does, it is a prize, and even then, as we will see, it can fool the very people who study it, right up to the present day. Colour survives even less often, and reaching it required a tool the Victorians could not have dreamed of. Yet reach it we have, for a small handful of animals, and the results are astonishing precisely because they are not invented. I want to be honest with you about that word, invented, because it is the whole difference between the Sydenham dinner and the science that followed. The Victorians filled their gaps with imagination and presented the result as knowledge. The work we are going to trace does something harder and slower. It keeps the guess and the fact in separate hands. It says, this we can measure, and this we can only infer, and this we simply do not know. That discipline, holding those three things apart, is what turned a room full of confident diners into a science that can actually be trusted. Where the evidence is firm, I will tell you so. Where it is inference, strong but still inference, I will say that too. And where the honest answer is that no one yet knows, we will sit with the not knowing, because that is part of the truth as well. Think of it as a series of translations, each one riskier than the last. Bone to muscle is the first translation, and it is well grounded, because we can watch how muscle marks bone in living animals and read the fossil the same way. Muscle to skin is harder, skin to texture, harder still, texture to colour, harder again, and possible for only a lucky few. At every step the ground grows softer under our feet, and the honest scientist slows down and checks the footing. The Victorians did not slow down. They sprinted from a single thumb bone straight to a finished face, and got the face wrong. And yet I do not want you to leave that candlelit table thinking only of the error. There is something almost tender in what Hawkins and Owen attempted. They wanted the public to feel the reality of a vanished world, to stand beside a creature that had been gone for ages beyond counting, and sense that it had once been real, once been flesh, once cast a shadow on wet ground. Every reconstruction since, right down to the ones built from measured pigment in a modern laboratory, shares that same impulse, the wish to make the lost world stand up again. What changed was not the wish. What changed was the rigour. Picture the scene once more, because we are about to leave it. Candles gutter low inside the plaster shell. The winter night presses against the cold cement. 21 men lift their glasses in the belly of an animal that had died before the first flower bloomed, an animal whose face they have crowned with a bone from its own hand, and they toast the triumph of knowing. They are wrong in 100 small ways and one large one. They are also braver than almost anyone who came before them, because they dared to build the thing at all, to say out loud, "This is what it looked like," and to be measured against the rock forever after. Outside that shell, the real animal waits in the ground, in quarries and cliffs and riverbanks scattered across the world. Its true shape is written in stone, in the ridges on its bones, in the rare imprint of its hide, in microscopic grains of pigment that no candle could ever have revealed. All of it is there, patient, unread. The men at the table cannot see it. They have run ahead of their evidence, and the evidence has not caught up. Ours is the slower path and the surer one. We will not sprint. We will climb the ladder rung by rung from the hardest bone to the faintest ghost of colour, and we will test our weight on every step. We will meet the animals that finally forced the science to grow up, the small feathered hunters and the great shaggy giants and the duck-billed herbivore still wearing the pattern of its skin. We will meet the researchers who learn to read a fossil the way you might read a fingerprint patiently, without flinching from what it refuses to tell them. But all of that begins here, in the dark, with a thumb on a nose and a dinner in a monster's ribs. It begins with men who wanted more than anything to see the unseeable, and who reached for imagination because they had nothing better yet to reach for. Everything that came after was a long correction of this one bright, flawed, wonderful night. The correction did not start with a grander guess. It started with humility and with rock. Consider the quarry itself in the summer of 1861. In the Solnhofen beds of Bavaria, workers have spent generations splitting pale limestone into flat, even sheets. The stone is fine enough to hold the print of a dragonfly's wing. On one ordinary day, a labourer sets his chisel into a slab and taps it apart along its natural grain. The rock opens like a book. Pressed into the white surface lies a small skeleton, flattened, delicate, and fringed along the arms with the unmistakable shape of feathers. You should let that image settle for a moment. A feather printed in stone, in rock far older than any bird had any right to be. The animal was about the size of a crow, perhaps a raven at its largest. Its bones were slender and hollow-looking, its limbs splayed as if it had fallen and never risen. Around the forelimbs, radiating outward, were the veins of long feathers, each barb caught in the lime as a thin brown film. To the eye of the time, feathers meant one thing only. Feathers meant a bird. Yet this creature carried a mouthful of small, sharp teeth, and that was not a bird's trait at all. The slab travelled from the quarry into the hands of scholars, and word of it spread quickly. In that same year, the German paleontologist Hermann von Meyer gave the creature its name. He called it Anchiornis lithographica. The first word means ancient wing. The second honours the lithographic limestone that had preserved it, the very stone prized for its flawless printable surface. It was a careful, almost modest name for an object that unsettled everything around it. What made this small skeleton so strange was not any single feature. It was the combination. Here, in one animal, were traits that had always belonged to separate worlds. The feathers and the broad asymmetrical wings spoke of birds. The jaws lined with teeth spoke of reptiles. Each wing ended not in a smooth bird's pinion but in 3 slender fingers, tipped with curved claws, as if the animal could still grip and climb. And trailing behind it was a long, bony tail, a row of vertebrae running well past the hips, feathered along its length like a narrow banner. No living bird has such a tail. Its skeleton is fused into a short stub. This creature wore its tail like a lizard. You are looking, in other words, at a mosaic. Part reptile, part bird, assembled in a single body that no one had predicted and no one could easily explain away. It sat squarely in the gap that everyone assumed was empty, the space between 2 great branches of a life. And it had been sitting there in the Bavarian stone, waiting to be split open. The first fine skeleton, the one von Meyer described, came to be known as the London specimen, after the museum that acquired it. It is not the most beautiful of the set, but it was first, and being first, it carried the weight of the argument. Its feather impressions were clear enough to silence any claim that this was mere reptile misread. The feathers were there, printed plainly, in a rock more than 100 million years too old to hold them by the rules of the day. Then, roughly a decade later, in the 1870s, the quarries gave up a second, greater treasure. Found in the beds near the town of Eichstätt, this one would become the Berlin specimen, and it remains to this day among the most celebrated fossils ever recovered. Where the first was scattered and partial, this second skeleton lay nearly complete and beautifully composed. Its head is thrown back, the neck arched in the pose that drying carcasses so often take. Its jaws still hold their teeth. Its wings are spread, and the feathers fan out from the arms in orderly rows, each shaft, each vein, each fine barb caught in the stone, with a clarity that seems impossible for something so old. When you look at good images of it, you are seeing a moment of death printed as cleanly as a leaf pressed in a heavy book. To understand why any of this survived, you have to leave the quarry and stand in your mind on the shore of the sea that made the stone. In the late Jurassic, roughly 150 million years ago, this part of what is now southern Germany was not dry land at all. It was a scatter of low, dry islands set in a warm, shallow sea. Between the islands and reefs lay quiet basins of water, and it is one of these that did the delicate work of preservation. Picture a lagoon, cut off from the open sea by reefs and banks. The water sits still under a hard sun. Little stirs it. Salt concentrates in it until it grows heavy and hostile, far saltier than the ocean beyond. Down near the bottom, the water holds almost no oxygen at all. Nothing lives there. No scavenger crawls across that floor to tear at a fallen body. No thriving colony of bacteria hurries decay along. It is, in the plainest sense, a dead zone, and that deadness is exactly what saves the dead. Now imagine an Archaeopteryx out over the islands that falls to the water. Perhaps it drowned. Perhaps it died on shore and was washed out by a storm. Its small body drifts, waterlogged, and slowly sinks. It settles onto that still, poisoned floor where nothing waits to disturb it. Fine lime mud, soft as wet chalk, sifts down and covers it grain by grain. The feathers, splayed in the water, are pressed flat and held in place before they can rot away. Over immense spans of time, the mud hardens into that famously smooth limestone, and the feathers remain as thin carbon films, a shadow of the living animal traced in stone. That is why the Solnhofen beds are so precious. In most places on the ancient earth, soft tissue was the first thing to vanish. Feathers, skin, the outlines of muscle, all of it usually gone long before the bone was buried. Here, in this salty, breathless lagoon, the softest details were the ones that endured. The quarry that supplied the smoothest writing stone happened, by the same fine grain, to be a near-perfect trap for the most fragile impressions life can leave. This is a good moment to pause the story and say one honest thing. It is the kind of quiet you might carry with you, so follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Now back to the animal on the slab, because there is a question about it that is still not settled, and you deserve to hear it stated plainly. Could Archaeopteryx actually fly? It is tempting to assume that feathers and wings mean flight, the full, flapping, powered flight of a modern bird. The honest answer is more careful. The wings are broad, and the flight feathers are asymmetrical, narrow on one side of the shaft and wider on the other. In living birds, that lopsided shape is a signature of feathers, built to generate lift, feathers that work against moving air. So this was not a random fringe of down. The wing had the look of an airfoil, but the rest of the skeleton complicates the picture. The bones of the chest do not show the deep keeled breastbone that anchors the great flight muscles of a strong flyer. The shoulder joint may not have allowed the full, high upstroke that powerful flapping demands. Researchers weigh these clues against one another. They estimate what is called wing loading, the animal's weight set against the area of its wings, and they study the fine structure of the feathers. From all of this, they infer a range of possibilities rather than a single answer. Some picture an animal that could glide well between trees or across open ground, using height and gravity more than muscle. Others allow for brief bursts of weak, fluttering, powered flight, short hops through the air rather than sustained journeys. Very few would call it a soaring master of the sky. The truthful summary is that the exact style of its flight remains debated, drawn from models and comparisons rather than settled by any single, decisive bone. You're allowed to hold that uncertainty. It is part of what makes the creature honest. What is not debated is the shape of what was found. The feathers are real, printed in the stone. The teeth are real. The clawed fingers, the long bony tail, the small hollow bones, all of it lay there in the Bavarian limestone, direct and undeniable, a body that mixed two worlds. Everything after this depended on people being willing to look at that mixture without flinching, and to describe it exactly as it was. Because that is the quiet lesson underneath the drama of the quarry. The slab did not announce its meaning. It offered only impressions in pale rock, faint films and fine ridges, a scatter of small bones in a chaotic pose. Someone had to look closely enough to see that a feather was a feather, and a tooth was a tooth, and honest enough to let both be true at once. The whole later history of reading fossil skin, fossil colour, and fossil flight grew out of that willingness to sit with a hard slab and take it seriously. Everything that followed began with a simple, patient act, learning to read the bones themselves. Everything that followed began with a simple, patient act, learning to read the bones themselves. Set a single thigh bone on the table in front of you. It belonged to an animal that walked and fed and died 66 million years ago. From across the room, the bone looks smooth and plain. Up close, it is neither. Run a fingertip slowly along its length, and you feel a landscape. There are long ridges here, and shallow pits, and rough raised patches like dried mud on a boot. None of this is accident or damage. Every mark on that surface means something. This is where the reading begins. Bone is not a dead scaffold. In a living animal, it is busy, living tissue, threaded with blood and rebuilt year after year. Where a muscle anchors onto bone, it pulls. That steady daily pull leaves a signature behind. A large muscle under heavy load roughens the surface into a raised grainy scar. A thick tendon can carve a sharp crest, or raise a small hard knob that anatomists call a tubercle. All of these together have a name. They are called osteological correlates. The phrase sounds heavy, but the idea underneath it is light and clean. Hard bone keeps a faithful record of the soft tissue that once gripped it, so the paleontologist becomes a reader of scars. You are looking, in effect, at a set of handprints. A muscle that gripped this ridge left the ridge behind, the way a rope wears a smooth groove into a wooden rail over years of hauling. The bigger and stronger the muscle, the deeper and rougher the mark. A crest that stands tall and coarse tells you a powerful muscle pulled there again and again across a lifetime. A faint, smooth patch tells you the opposite, a slighter muscle, a lighter load. You're feeling the difference the way your fingers feel the calluses on a working hand, and guess at the labour behind them. This is careful, unglamorous work, and it is the foundation of everything. Before anyone can paint a dinosaur or feather it, or set it running across a screen, someone has to answer a plainer question. Where did the flesh actually go? A skeleton on its own is a coat rack. It gives you the frame and the hard points, but the shape of the animal, the bulge of the thigh, the swell of the tail, the thickness of the neck, all of that lived in muscle that rotted away long ago. The scars are the bridge. They tell you where the muscle attached and roughly how much of it there was. But a scar has a limit. It can tell you a muscle was here and that it was strong. It cannot, on its own, tell you the muscle's exact shape, or how far it reached, or what it was going to do when the animal moved. For that, the scar needs a second witness. It needs a living animal built on the same plan, an animal you can dissect and measure and watch, so you can see which muscle leaves which mark. And here the reconstruction runs into a hard fact. Every dinosaur that ever left a muscle scar is extinct. There is nothing left alive to open up and compare, or so it can seem at first. Except that is not quite true. And the way around it is one of the most elegant tools in all of paleontology. To understand it, you have to look at the dinosaur's family and find the living cousins still standing on either side of it. Consider the family tree drawn out like the branching of a river seen from above. Dinosaurs sit on one branch. On the tree, their closest living relatives fall into two groups. On one side stand the crocodilians, the alligators and crocodiles and their kin, an ancient lineage that split away deep in the past. On the other side stand the birds, and birds are not merely relatives of dinosaurs. Birds are dinosaurs, the living feathered survivors of the group, branch that came through the great extinction and kept flying. So a dinosaur fossil sits neatly between two living bookends. Crocodilians on one shelf, birds on the other. The extinct animal is held between them. Anatomists call this the extant phylogenetic bracket. Extant simply means still living. The bracket is the pair of living groups that flank the fossil on the family tree, and the method built on it is beautifully simple in its logic. You cannot dissect a dinosaur, but you can dissect a crocodile and you can dissect an ostrich. You can trace in each of them exactly which muscle attaches to which bump on the bone. Then you look at both living relatives together and ask a single question. What do they share? Here is the power of it. Suppose a certain muscle anchors to a certain ridge in birds, and the very same muscle anchors to the very same ridge in crocodilians. The two living bookends agree. Now the logic tightens. Both groups inherited that arrangement from a shared ancestor, an ancestor that also gave rise to the dinosaurs sitting between them. So when you find that same ridge on a dinosaur bone, you can infer with real confidence that the same muscle was there too. Not a guess pulled from imagination. An inference braced on both sides by living flesh you can actually cut and study. That bracket is why modern muscle reconstructions have weight behind them. When a researcher rebuilds the jaw muscles of a Tyrannosaurus, or the thigh muscles of a long-necked sauropod, they are not sculpting by eye. They are working outward from the scars on the bone, and checking every one of them against the crocodile on one side and the bird on the other. Where both cousins agree, the reconstruction stands on firm ground. The bracket turns a bare skeleton into a body, muscle group by muscle group, each one anchored to evidence you can hold. And once you have the muscles, you can begin to ask how the animal moved. This is where bone starts to become behaviour. A muscle scar tells you not only that a muscle was present, but where it pulled from and where it pulled to. A muscle that runs from the hip down to a lever on the shin swings the leg backward and drives the animal forward. Measure the size of the scar, estimate the bulk of the muscle, and you begin to estimate force. Force at the hip, force at the jaw, force in the grip of a clawed hand. The dead bone starts to push and pull again inside your understanding of it. The results reshaped the animals completely, and it is worth sitting with how wrong the first attempts had been. When dinosaurs were first assembled in the 1800s, no one had this toolkit. So the early anatomists reached for the animals they knew, and the animals they knew were sprawling reptiles and lumbering giants. A great predator was imagined as a kind of scaled-up lizard, standing half upright, its heavy tail slumped down to drag along the ground behind it like a thick anchor chain. A big plant-eater was pictured wading in swamps, too heavy, it was thought, to hold itself up on land. These were reasonable guesses for their day. They were also, in the end, mostly wrong. The tail draggers are the clearest lesson. Look at the tail vertebrae of a large predatory dinosaur, and read the scars along them. Powerful muscles ran from the base of the tail to the thigh bone. In a living animal, those muscles do not let the tail flop. They hold it out stiff and level as a counterweight. Then look at the joints between the tail bones themselves, the way they meet and lock. A dragged tail would have ground itself raw against the earth. A tail held straight out, balancing the weight of the head and chest at the other end, fits the anatomy far better. The animal was not a slumped tail-dragging monster. It was a taut level thing, balanced over its hips like a plank balanced across a fence rail. That single correction changed the whole silhouette. Bring the tail up off the ground and the spine swings toward the horizontal. The head comes forward and low, the tail streams out behind, and the whole body pivots over the two driving legs. Suddenly the animal is built for motion. It is balanced, sprung, ready to stride. The heavy tail is no longer dead weight dragging in the mud, but a living counterbalance that let the animal run without tipping onto its face. The dinosaurs did not physically change across those years. Only our reading of them did. The bones had always said this. It simply took a long while to learn the language. You are, in a sense, still standing beside that revised animal, watching it hold its balance. Before we follow it out onto open ground, let me say one plain thing to you, quietly. If these slow walks through deep time are doing their work, follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. It costs you nothing, and it keeps the lamp lit for the next long night. Now, back to the animal, and to the ground it walked across, because there is a second record of movement, and it does not come from bone at all. It comes from footprints. Across the world, dinosaurs left trackways, lines of prints pressed into old mud and then buried and hardened into stone. A single footprint tells you the shape of a foot. A whole trackway tells you something better. It tells you how the animal was walking right there on that day in that mud. The prints are a frozen moment of behaviour, not a bone dug from a grave, but a living step you can still measure. The insight that unlocked them came from a biomechanist studying how animals move today. His method was almost childishly simple, and it worked. Measure the length of the stride, the distance between one footfall and the next of the same foot. Then compare that stride to the height of the animal's hip, which you can estimate from the size of the print. A short stride for a tall animal means a slow, ambling walk. A long stride means a stretch, a trot, a run. He tested the idea against living animals crossing soft ground, and the numbers held. A stride relative to hip height is a speedometer written in mud. Now turn that key on a real fossil trackway and behaviour falls out of the rock. There is a theropod trackway in China, a hunter's path that runs on for roughly 230 feet, the longest such trail known in that country. Along it, researchers mapped 81 separate footprints, one after another, and read the spacing between them like beads on a string. The stride told the speed. This particular predator was not charging or fleeing. It was walking steadily at a little over 3 miles an hour. That is a stroll, a brisk human walking pace. A large meat-eater crossing a floodplain in no particular hurry, 81 calm steps preserved in stone, each one exactly where the animal set it down. Sit with how intimate that is. You're not looking at a skeleton arranged by a museum. You're looking at a walk. The animal lived and moved through what, to the slow patience of the rock, was a geological instant, and yet the mud caught one ordinary afternoon and kept it. The spacing of the prints, the depth of each one, whether the trail runs straight or curved, whether two trackways cross, all of it is behaviour, frozen and readable. Trackways have shown dinosaurs walking in herds, the small ones sheltered in the middle. They have shown predators pacing the same shoreline as their prey. Bone gives you the machine. Footprints show you the machine in use. Put the two records together, the scars on the bone and the steps in the stone, and the reconstruction grows sturdy. The muscle scars tell you the animal could move this way. The trackways confirm that it did. When a modern reconstruction shows a predator balanced over its hips, tail level, striding forward at a walking pace, that posture is not a fashion or a whim. It is the meeting point of two independent lines of evidence, the anatomy and the footprints, each checked against the living cousins on either side of the family tree. And yet, for all its power, this method has honest edges, and it matters to name them clearly. The bracket gives you strong inference. It does not give you certainty. When both crocodilians and birds share a feature, and the dinosaur's bones show the matching scar, you can be genuinely confident. That is close to the firm ground of fact. But the confidence weakens as the agreement weakens. Suppose only one living cousin has a muscle, and the other does not. Now the bracket is split. The scar on the fossil might mean the muscle was there, or it might not. You can still make a reasoned estimate, but you must flag it plainly as the weaker call it is. There is a deeper limit still, and it is the most interesting one. Some dinosaurs wore features that no living animal has on either side of the bracket. There is no crocodile with a row of tall plates marching down its spine. There is no bird with a bony frill flaring out behind its skull, or 3 horns jutting from its face, or a neck stretched longer than a bus. These structures sit outside the bracket entirely. The living bookends simply cannot vote on them, because neither one has ever carried anything like them. Here the confident method runs out of road, and the reconstruction has to lean on other clues, on the bone shape itself, on comparison to distant analogies, on careful, hedged reasoning. The honest scientist tells you which parts of the animal are braced by living flesh, and which parts are a best estimate reaching into the dark. This is the discipline that separates modern reconstruction from the old guesswork, and it runs through everything that follows. At every step, the good researcher keeps 2 columns in mind. In one column sits direct evidence, the thing the fossil actually shows you. This ridge is real. This scar is real. This footprint is real, and its spacing measures this speed. In the other column sits inference, the reasoning built on top of the evidence. This ridge probably held this muscle, because both living cousins hold it there. This animal probably walked upright and level, because the tail muscles and the joints and the trackways all agree. Keeping those columns apart is the whole craft. It is what lets you rebuild a body from a skeleton without fooling yourself, and without fooling you. So the frame comes together, patiently, one braced inference at a time. From the roughened scars on the bone, you recover the muscles. From the muscles you recover the posture and the push of the legs. From the footprints in the mud you recover the gait and the speed, and sometimes the company the animal kept. From the living bracket of birds and crocodilians, you check every step of it against flesh you can still touch. Layer by layer, the coat rack fills in. The bare skeleton swells back into a living body, balanced over its hips, muscled at the thigh and jaw, striding at a calm 3 miles an hour across a warm and vanished floodplain. Stand back from that rebuilt animal and look at it in the low light. You can see its bulk now, the heavy tail held out straight, the deep chest, the powered legs. You can watch it walk and trust the walk because 81 footprints in far-off stone say it walked exactly so. This is a real triumph, and it is easy to undervalue because it is so quiet. 150 years ago, the best minds put a thumb spike on a nose and dragged the tails in the dirt. Now the reconstruction is disciplined, bracketed, checked, and honest about its own edges. The bones learn to speak, and we slowly learn to listen. And still, standing there, you're looking at a body with no surface. You have the muscle and the motion, the mass and the balance. What you do not yet have is the skin over all of it. You cannot see from a scar whether this animal was scaled or feathered, drab or banded, armoured or soft. The frame is magnificent and the frame is bare. The outermost layer, the very thing your eye would have landed on first if you had stood beside the living creature, is exactly the layer that rots first and survives least. For most dinosaurs, most of the time that surface is simply gone, and everything about it is estimate. Consider the ground itself, and what a walking animal presses into it. Picture wet mud on a Cretaceous floodplain, firm enough to hold a shape, soft enough to take one. A large meat-eater crosses that flat on 2 legs. Each foot sinks, holds for an instant, then lifts, and the mud settles a little behind it. Nothing about that moment feels like a measurement, and yet the spacing of those prints is a recording of speed, written in the oldest ink there is. The trick for reading it comes from a zoologist and biomechanist named McNeill Alexander. He noticed something plain and powerful about the way animals move. A walking creature swings each leg like a pendulum hanging from the hip. A running one abandons that easy swing and starts to bound, and the switch between the two happens not at some fixed speed, but at a speed that scales with the length of the leg doing the swinging. Think of your own stride for a moment. When you stroll, your steps stay short and even. When you hurry, they stretch out. A tall person covers more ground per step than a child, yet both feel like an ordinary walk. Alexander's insight was that this relationship is regular enough to run in reverse. If you know how long the legs were and how far apart the footprints fell, you can estimate how fast the animal was travelling when it made them. The key ratio is stride length compared with hip height. Stride length is the distance from one print to the next print of the same foot, a full cycle of the same leg. Hip height is roughly the ground to hip measurement, the effective length of the pendulum. Divide the first by the second, and you get a clean, unitless number. A small ratio means short steps for the size of the leg, the signature of a walk. A large ratio means the animal was reaching, pushing, and eventually leaving the ground, the signature of a run. The beauty of it is the calibration. Alexander did not simply assert these thresholds. He measured living animals, from people to horses to a range of other movers, timing them across known distances and recording their stride ratios at each pace. That living data became the yardstick. When you lay a fossil trackway against it, you are comparing an extinct animal's steps to a library of steps whose speeds were actually clocked. The dinosaur is gone, but the physics of a swinging limb has not changed in 150 million years. So how do you read a real trackway, print by print, with only the rock in front of you? You start with the footprints themselves. Depth tells you about the ground and the load. A deep, sharp impression suggests soft sediment or a heavy planted step. A shallow, smeared one suggests firmer footing or a lighter, quicker touch. You note where the mud pushed up in a rim at the edges and whether the toes dug in at the front, the way your own foot bites the ground when you accelerate. Then you measure spacing. The distance between successive prints, left to right to left, is the pace. The distance between 2 prints of the same foot is the stride. You also measure the pace angle. The angle traced through 3 consecutive footfalls. A narrow zigzag angle belongs to a slow, wide-based amble. A wide angle, close to a straight line, belongs to a faster gait, where the feet swing in almost directly beneath the body like a rope drawn taut. Hip height is the one number you cannot lift straight off the rock, and here the method leans on a rule of thumb. For many bipedal dinosaurs, hip height comes out at roughly 4 times the length of the footprint. A footprint 1 foot long implies a hip standing near 4 feet off the ground. It is an approximation, drawn from the proportions of skeletons whose feet and legs we do have. But it turns a flat smear of mud into a standing animal, and it gives Alexander's equation the one value it needs to finish the sum. You can feel the whole chain now. Foot length gives you hip height. Print to print gives you stride. Stride over hip height gives you the ratio. The ratio checked against living animals gives you a speed. From 4 toe marks in ancient clay, you arrive at a number in miles per hour, without ever seeing the creature take a single step. Which brings you to one of the longest such records anyone has studied, a trackway in China. It runs for roughly 230 feet across the stone, the longest theropod trackway documented anywhere in that country. Researchers know it by a plain catalogue label, the trackway logged as HXT3. Along its length march 81 footprints, a single individual's journey frozen in place, one deliberate step at a time. A recent reanalysis treated that whole span as one continuous problem to solve. Rather than eyeballing a few good prints, the team mapped all 81 digitally, capturing the position, the length, and the spacing of each one as precise coordinates. That matters, because a trackway is never perfectly regular. The ground firms and softens, the animal drifts, hesitates, corrects. By digitizing the entire line, you can watch the stride ratio rise and fall along its length, instead of trusting a single lucky pair of prints to speak for the whole walk. And what the walk said, once every print had been fed through Alexander's equation, was remarkably calm. The gait stayed consistent from one end to the other. No sudden lengthening of stride, no burst where the ratio spiked into running territory. The speed held at a median of about 3 3/10 miles per hour. That is an ordinary walking pace, slower than a brisk human stroll, the pace of an animal with somewhere to be, but no reason to rush. Sit with that for a moment because it is easy to miss how much it overturns. The popular image of a large theropod is a sprinting hunter, all speed and lunge. But 81 steps of hard evidence describe a steady commuter, moving across its floodplain at the pace of a slow walk, holding that pace the way you might on a long, flat road. A consistent walking gait sustained over 200 feet is not the trace of a chase. It is the trace of routine, an animal crossing familiar ground toward water or food, or simply the far side of the mudflat. That is the quiet reward of the method. It does not just hand you a speed, it hands you a behaviour, a mood almost, the difference between an animal that was travelling and one that was hunting. A single trackway becomes a few minutes of a life you can actually stand beside. But you must be honest about what the method cannot do, because its limits are as important as its results. The first and largest is this: a trackway captures a moment, not a maximum. Those 81 prints record what the animal happened to be doing on that stretch of ground, on that afternoon. They say nothing about how fast it could run when frightened, or lunging, or fleeing. An animal caught strolling to water tells you its cruising pace, not its top speed, in the same way that a person walking to fetch something reveals nothing of how fast they might sprint from danger. Almost every trackway ever found records a walk, simply because animals there's now spend most of their lives not running. The second limit hides inside that tidy chain of reasoning. Every speed rests on the hip height, and the hip height rests on an assumption, the estimate that the animal stood about 4 times its foot length at the hip. Change that ratio and the speed shifts with it. A track maker with unusually long or short legs for its feet would throw the estimate off and you cannot always tell from prints alone which kind of animal left them. The number that comes out the far end is only ever as firm as the standing height you fed in, so it helps to keep two things clearly apart in your mind. The spacing is measured, the speed is inferred. The distance between those footprints is a hard fact, a length you could lay a ruler against today, as real as the rock. The speed is a careful reconstruction built on top of that fact, resting on the pendulum physics of a leg, on living animals timed across known ground, and on an educated guess about how tall the maker stood. One you can touch. The other you must reason your way toward, and label plainly as reasoning when you do. Held that way, honestly, the method is one of the most quietly astonishing things in all of paleontology. It reaches past bone entirely. It does not need a skeleton or a tooth or a scrap of preserved tissue. It needs only the negative space an animal left in soft ground on an ordinary day and the unchanging arithmetic of a swinging limb. From that, and from the timed strides of animals still walking the earth, you recover a pace, a gait, a fragment of behaviour that no skeleton could ever confess on its own. This is how much movement you can read from absence, from the shape of a step rather than the animal that took it. It tells you how a body carried itself across the world, at what speed, in what mood, on ground long since turned to stone. But muscle and posture are only the frame, because now and then the skin itself survives. But muscle and posture are only the frame, because now and then the skin itself survives. But muscle and posture are only the frame, because now and then the skin itself survives, not the bone beneath it, the outside of the animal. Picture a low floodplain in what is now the Badlands near Marmarth, North Dakota. The rock there belongs to the Hell Creek Formation, laid down roughly 66 to 67 million years ago. It marks the last long chapter before the end of the age of dinosaurs. And lying inside that rock, curled on one side, is a duck-billed dinosaur that still seems to be wearing its own skin. The animal is Edmontosaurus annectens, a broad, heavy plant-eater with a flat snout and no horns. The specimen has a plainer name. People call it Dakota. Its story begins in 1999 on a family ranch, when a high school student named Tyler Lyson walked out across his uncle's land. He found bone weathering out of a hillside. He marked it, and he left it. The way you leave a thing you cannot yet lift. Years passed. When he came back to dig it out in earnest starting in 2004, the ground gave up far more than a skeleton. It gave up the covering. Along the arm and the tail and the flank, the sediment held impressions of skin, not smooth and blank but textured, patterned, alive with detail. You could see individual scales, tiny and tight-packed, arranged the way pebbles sit in a dry riverbed. You could see where the skin stretched and where it gathered, and at the back end, running along the midline of the tail, there were raised structures, a low crest of soft spikes that no one had drawn on this animal before because no one had known they were there. The bones alone would never have told you, only the skin did. The forefeet told their own quiet story. Where you might expect splayed fingers or a broad pad, the fossil preserved a covering over the front of each foot, a rounded sheath a little like a hoof. So this was not an animal that walked flat on soft toes. On its front limbs it walked on something firmer, a padded hoof-like tread built to carry real weight across wet ground. That single detail rewrites how you imagine the creature moving. It changes the sound of its step. It changes the print it left in the mud. Look closely, and the skin does something even more revealing. Across the length of the body, from the head back toward the tail, researchers counted at least 5 distinct scale patterns. The scales were not uniform. They changed shape and size depending on where they sat. Over the broad, unbending parts of the body, the scales ran large and even, like tile across a wide floor. But at the joints, at the elbow, at the knee, at the places where the animal had to fold and open all day long, the scales shrank. They clustered small and fine, packed close together. And that is not decoration, that is engineering. Think of the back of your own hand, of the fine, loose creases over each knuckle that let the joint close without the skin splitting. Coarse scale over a bending joint would crack or bind. Fine scale flexes. So the very texture of Dakota's hide records how the living animal held itself and how it moved. Elbow and knee working through their full range under a covering built to bend with them. The skin is not a still portrait. It is a record of motion, but skin does not usually last. This is the part worth slowing down for. Flesh is the first thing to go. When most animals die, the soft parts rot, get scavenged, get scattered, and the bare bones are all that has any chance of becoming stone. To preserve the outer skin of a dinosaur across tens of millions of years, the ordinary sequence of decay has to be interrupted. Something unusual has to happen fast in the first days before the body comes apart. For a long time, the favoured explanation was drying. Picture the end of the Cretaceous coastal plain, humid and green, but crossed by seasons and dry spells. An Edmontosaurus dies out on that floodplain, away from deep water. Instead of bloating and bursting in a swamp, the carcass dries in open air. The skin dehydrates and pulls in tight over the skeleton. The way a gourd left too long on the vine shrinks down hard around its own ribs. The soft insides collapse. What is left is a taut, leathery shell, a natural mummy sagging against the bones underneath. That is why the finest detail clusters where it does. As the skin dried and tightened, it clung hardest at the joints, moulding itself to every crease. Then came the second event, the one that mattered most for preservation. A river flooded. Water spread across the plain and buried the dried carcass, and it did so quickly before the shell could weather away to nothing. The sediment settled into the shape of the body. Fine mud pressed into every wrinkle and every scale, filling the texture the way soft wax takes the print of a seal. The skin gave the mud its pattern. The mud began to turn to stone, and the pattern stayed. You can see why a fossil like this feels almost unfair, almost too generous. Most of deep time is a story of loss, of everything soft stripped away. A skin mummy is the rare case where the erasure paused just long enough, and Dakota is not entirely alone. From the same corner of North Dakota comes a related Edmontosaurus that carries a darker mark. Across some of its preserved bone and skin, paleontologists found bite traces. In 2022, those marks were read as the work of an ancient crocodile relative, feeding on the carcass. It stands as some of the first soft tissue evidence of that kind of scavenging on a dinosaur body, a reptile working over the dead flank at the water's edge, tens of millions of years ago, caught in the fossil like a scene held still. So for well over a century, this was the settled picture. Dinosaur mummies were treasures. The skin they carried was, everyone assumed, the animal's real skin, dried and flattened and turned to rock, but genuinely the original hide. Museums labelled it that way. Fossilised skin. And you would file past it and take the words at face value, because why would you not? The texture is right there. The scales are right there. It reads, to any honest eye, like the true outer surface of a creature that breathed. Then, in 2025, that assumption cracked open. A study in the journal Science, led by the paleontologist Paul Serino with the fossil preparator Tyler Keeler, went back to duck-billed mummies with fresh questions and sharper tools. These specimens came from the Lance Formation of east-central Wyoming, rock of about the same age, roughly 66 million years old. Among them was a young Edmontosaurus, an animal only about 2 years old when it died, small enough that the team gave it a fond, plain nickname. They called it Ed Jr., and when they looked hard at what everyone had been calling skin, they found something that stopped them. The skin was not skin, or at least the layer preserving the texture was not what people had thought. What they measured was a film of clay, a skin of clay if you like, less than a single millimetre thick, thinner than a fingernail. And this clay layer was not the animal's tissue turned to stone. It was a mould, an external template formed on the outside of the decaying carcass as fine mineral clay gathered against the skin surface and set into its shape. The clay recorded the texture of the skin the way a death mask records a face, faithfully in exquisite detail, while being made of entirely different stuff. What you had been looking at in this reading was not the hide itself. It was the negative the hide left behind, pressed in clay, before the hide was gone. Sit with how strange and how ordinary that is at once. The pattern is true. The scales are real scales, in the sense that they were shaped by real scales. The fine texture at the joints genuinely records where the joints bent. None of that is illusion, but the substance carrying the pattern may be mineral through and through, a clay cast a fraction of a millimetre thick, rather than the transformed remains of living skin. It is the difference between a footprint and a foot. Both are honest. Only one is the animal. The mechanism the team described fits the drying and burial story, but it sharpens it. The carcass mummifies on the plain, skin tightening over bone. Then it is buried on land, on the floodplain, not sunk in a lake, and in that setting a thin clay template forms against the dried skin, taking its shape before the organic material finishes breaking down. The word the study reaches for is templating. The skin acts as a form, and the clay is what fills it. So the exquisite fossil you admire is, in large part, the rock's memory of the skin rather than the skin preserved. And here is where an honest documentary has to stop and hold still, because the researchers themselves refuse to overreach. They do not claim the skin is gone. They claim something more careful and more interesting. Whether any original organic material still survives, tucked beneath that clay film or trapped within it, remains, in their own words, unresolved. Not answered no, not answered yes, open. The clay template is real and measurable. What lies under it, at the scale of molecules, is the question they are leaving on the table honestly for the next round of work to settle. That is a rare and valuable kind of scientific sentence. It resists the tidy ending, and it reopens a great many old drawers at once. Because if the classic mummies are in significant part clay masks, then a century of confident museum labels reading fossilized skin now carries a quiet asterisk. Not wrong exactly, but less certain than the word suggested. Some of what generations of visitors understood as preserved dinosaur hide may be in truth the mould that the hide left as it vanished. The texture survived the tissue, and telling those two things apart at last is real work with real stakes. You might feel a small loss in that, a treasured certainty softened into a maybe. But hold the other side of it too, because the science here is the entertainment. Look at what the finding actually does. It does not erase the animal. It refines the tool. Every reconstruction that leans on mummy skin now comes with a sharper question attached. Is this the original material, or the clay portrait of it? And that question is answerable. It can be tested, layer by layer, specimen by specimen, with the kind of chemistry that can tell a mineral film from a molecule of ancient protein. What looked like an ending is really an instruction for where to point the microscope next. It is worth remembering how thin a knife you are working with here. Less than 1 millimetre. Everything paleontologists know about the outside of these duck-billed dinosaurs, the scales, the tail crest, the hoofed feet, the fine flecks at the joints, rides on a clay film thinner than a sheet of paper pressed against a body 66 million years dead. That the layer survived at all is astonishing. That it might be a mould rather than the thing itself does not diminish the astonishment. It only tells you to read the fossil with more care, to separate what the pattern shows from what the substance is, and the pattern still shows a great deal. Take Ed Jr. again, the 2-year-old. Even a mould that thin preserves the scale arrangement of juvenile, which lets you ask how the skin changed as the animal grew, whether the young wore a finer covering than the adults, whether the hoofed foot was already hardening in a small body still learning to carry itself. These are not idle questions. They are the difference between a cartoon of a dinosaur and a living organism with a life history, a hatchling that grew, a body that changed shape across its years. The skin, real hide or faithful clay, is one of the few places that history is written where you can still read it. Follow the thread a little further and something else comes into focus. If the outer covering can be captured as a mould, then the mould captures more than scales. It captures the fleshy midline down the back and tail, the soft crest that bone alone would never reveal. It captures the true outline, the real silhouette, the animal's actual edge against the air. For most dinosaurs, you infer that edge. You drape muscle over bone and guess where the skin fell. For these duckbills, the plane wrote it down. Even if the ink turned out to be clay, the writing is legible, and it says the animal was rounder, softer, and stranger at its outline than the skeleton alone would ever let you draw. So this is where the record of bear skin leaves you, honest and unfinished. You have the texture of an end Cretaceous giant, 5 kinds of scale from nose to tail, fine at the joints so the body could bend. You have hooves on the forefeet and a soft ridge down the spine. You have a preservation story of drying, flooding, and burial that turned a carcass into a template, and you have a genuinely open question at the heart of it. Whether the skin you admire is the animal's own tissue or the rock's faithful impression of it, a question the people closest to the fossils are careful not to answer before the evidence does. That is the boundary of what bear hide can tell you. Scales and folds and hooves, the covering of an animal built low and heavy and armoured in nothing but its own tough skin. For a long time, this was most of what anyone expected dinosaur skin to be. Reptilian, scaled, bare. A surface you could imagine by looking at a lizard on a warm rock and simply making it enormous. The Edmontosaurus mummies fit that expectation beautifully. Big body, tough hide, pebbled scales, no surprises in kind, only an exquisite detail. But that expectation was about to break, and it would break in a place far from North Dakota, in rock far older, split open on the far side of the world. Because scales and bare skin are only one answer to the question of what covered a dinosaur. There was another answer waiting in the ground, finer than any scale, softer than any hide. And for most of the history of this science, no one believed it could possibly be preserved. Stay with that skin a while longer, because the best place to understand it is not a museum drawer, but the living animal wearing it. So walk out onto a low coastal plain at the very end of the Cretaceous, about 66 million years ago, and stand near the water where the ground goes soft. The air is warm and heavy, thick enough to feel on the back of your neck. It smells of mud, of rotting leaves, of green things growing faster than they can be eaten. In front of you, an Edmontosaurus annectens lowers its head to feed. It is a duck-billed dinosaur, a hadrosaur, broad and unhurried, longer than a delivery truck and heavier than a small herd of cattle. Its back is a slow ridge of muscle. Its tail runs out behind it, held clear of the ground, thick at the base and tapering to a blunt line. Down the midline of that tail, and along the spine, a low crest of soft tissue catches the morning light. Nothing dramatic, just a fleshy ridge, the kind of detail that rarely survives. You're close enough to see the skin itself. It is pebbled with scales, none of them large, most no wider than a fingernail. Run your eye from the shoulder to the hip and the pattern shifts as it goes. Coarser scales cover the broad, flat planes of the flank. Finer, tighter scales gather where the animal has to bend. Around the knee, around the elbow, around each fold of the great hind legs, the scales grow small and dense, packed like grains of coarse sand. That is not decoration. That is engineering. Fine scales flex where the joint flexes and never bind the limb. Watch what happens when the animal shifts its weight. The forefoot comes down into the wet ground, and it lands not on splayed fingers but on a blunt, hoof-like pad, a mitten of tough skin over bone. The mud takes it cleanly. When the foot lifts again, a shallow print stays behind, filling slowly with brown water. All around, the flat is stitched with such prints, some fresh, some already softening at the edges. A herd has passed here. A herd is passing still. Lift your gaze and you can see them, scattered across the mud flats in the low light. Adults the size of this one. Younger animals, leaner and quicker, staying close to the big bodies. They do not move as a tight pack. They drift, heads down, spread across the open ground the way grazing animals spread today, each one a slow island of appetite. Now and then one raises its head, holds still and listens. Then it drops back to feeding, and the whole loose company breathes out together. Come back to the single animal in front of you and listen to it eat. There is a sound to it, steady and grinding like a millstone turning under wet grain. The Edmontosaurus has no simple teeth. Inside those long jaws sits a dental battery, hundreds of small teeth locked together into a single working surface, a living pavement of enamel and bone. As the top teeth wear, new teeth rise from beneath to replace them, so the grinding surface never fails and never dulls for long. Tough plant matter goes in at the front, cropped by a wide, toothless beak. Then the jaws close, and the battery does its patient work, and this plane gives it plenty to grind. The vegetation here is coarse and fibrous, ferns low to the ground, horsetails standing in the wet margins, the leathery fronds of cycads, the needled branches of conifers overhead. None of it is soft. All of it resists. A mammal today would starve trying to process such food in bulk, but this animal is built for exactly that. It crops, it grinds, it swallows, and it moves a step forward to crop again. The head swings low and slow, a broad shovel sweeping the ground clear. You can see the whole body serving that one task. The neck is muscular and flexible, so the beak can reach the low ferns without the animal kneeling. The great hind legs carry most of the weight, and the forelimbs, lighter, steady the front end as the head drops. When it wants higher brows, it shifts back onto those hind legs and rises, and for a moment it stands taller than the tallest thing you know, reaching branches no four-footed grazer could touch. Then it comes down again, gently, and the fine joint scales fold and open as the limbs bend, exactly as they were shaped to do. The river is never far. It runs broad and brown and shallow across the plain, and its banks are low, barely lifted above the water. In a dry week it is a quiet thing, easy to wade, easy to drink from. But this is a coast of sudden floods. Rain falling far inland can send a wall of muddy water down these channels with almost no warning, spilling out across the flats, drowning the low ground under a sheet of silt-heavy water in a matter of hours. The herd knows the river the way you know a familiar road. They feed near it, drink from it, and keep, without seeming to, a certain distance from its edge. For now the day is calm. The light comes up gold and flat across the mud, and the heat begins to build. Insects lift from the wet ground in slow clouds. Somewhere behind the tree line something large moves and goes quiet again, and every raised head in the herd turns toward it for a breath before returning to the grass. This is the whole of the animal's day, and it is enough. Feed, listen, move, feed again. There is no grand event coming that it can sense. There is only the plain, the water, the warm heavy air, and the endless work of the jaws. Stay with the skin one more moment, because everything you can see on this living animal is, in the ordinary way of things, about to be lost. When this Edmontosaurus dies, whether by flood or predator or simple age, the soft parts will go first. The fleshy ridge along its back, the scales at its joints, the tough pad of its foot, all of it should vanish within weeks, torn by scavengers, broken down by the small unseen life of the mud, scattered until only bare bone remains. That is the fate of nearly every animal that has ever lived. The body returns to the ground and leaves no picture of itself behind. But not always. Picture a different ending, the rare one. The carcass comes to rest on the open flat and no flood arrives at once. Instead, the days stay dry and hot and the body begins to shrink. The skin loses its water and draws down tight over the ribs and the long bones, sagging into every hollow, clinging to every joint the way a gourd left in the sun pulls in against its own frame. The wrinkles deepen. The scales stand out in sharp relief, pressed close to the skeleton beneath. The animal becomes a dried husk of itself, its shape held in leather where the flesh once was. And then, at last, the river does what rivers here do. The rain comes far off, the channel swells, and the flood arrives late but sure. Water sheets across the flat and lifts a load of fine sediment, and it settles over the dried carcass and around it and into it. Wet clay is pressed into the deep wrinkles of the neck, into the tight scales of the knee, into the blunt curve of the hoof, filling every fold before decay can finish its work. The husk is buried. The mud sets. The plain moves on above it, season over season, flood over flood, until the weight of the ground turns silt to stone. What that leaves behind, tens of millions of years later, is a thing that reads like skin. A surface stamped with the pattern of scales, coarse on the flank, fine at the joint, faithful down to grains no wider than sand. Whether the stone holds the animal's own skin, or only a mould that the clay took from it, is a question that still divides careful people, and it is not yours to settle standing here on the warm mud. What matters, in this quiet moment, is that the plain itself keeps the record. The heat that dries the body, the flood that buries it, the fine clay that remembers each wrinkle. This landscape is the reason you can look a duck-billed dinosaur in its pebbled hide at all, so watch it a while longer, this ordinary morning that will one day be extraordinary. The Edmontosaurus feeds, the battery grinds, the herd drifts across the flats, heads down, tails held level, the fleshy ridges along their backs catching the risen sun. Their skin is a masterpiece of scales, 5 patterns flowing head to tail, each grain placed where the body needs it, and for creatures like these that scaled hide is nearly the whole of the outer animal. Broad plates, fine joints, tough pads, bare warm skin over living muscle. For a long time this was the face every dinosaur turned to the world, and it was thought to be the only one. And where bare skin gave way to something finer, the shape of dinosaurs shifted once more, and where bare skin gave way to something finer, the shape of dinosaurs shifted once more, and where bare skin gave way to something finer, the shape of dinosaurs shifted once more. Picture a lake in what is now northeastern China. 125 million years ago. The air hangs warm and damp over still water. Ferns crowd the shoreline, and tall conifers stand back in dark ranks. This is the world paleontologists call the Geholbiota. It is a country of forest and quiet lakes, and it sits on a restless volcanic floor. You're standing at the edge of that water. Somewhere beyond the trees, the ground itself breathes heat. Now and then that ground does more than breathe. A vent opens somewhere in the highlands, and fine ash climbs into the sky. It drifts on the wind for miles. Then it falls. It settles on the leaves and the lake like grey snow, soft and endless, and it does not stop. Small animals caught in the open breathe it in. Some drown in the ash-choked water. Others simply lie down where they fall, and the falling grey covers them. That is the grim gift of this place. The same eruptions that killed these animals also buried them at once, fast and gently, before anything could pull them apart. No scavenger came to scatter the bones. No slow rot loosened the joints. The ash sealed each body like a hand closing over a moth, and because it fell so fine and so fast, it caught the things that almost never survive. Skin, stomach contents, and the thin, faint threads growing out of the skin itself. For most of the history of this science, nobody expected to find those threads. Dinosaurs were reptiles, and reptiles wore scales. That was the settled picture, drawn again and again in 1,000 books. A dinosaur was a lizard grown huge, hided and pebbled and bare. You have surely seen that version. It ruled the imagination for more than a century, and it felt like common sense. Then, in 1996, that common sense broke open on a single slab of Chinese stone. Quarry workers in Liaoning province split a block of fine grey rock along its grain. The rock parted the way a book falls open, and pressed flat inside it lay a small predator, no longer than your arm, curled in the pose of its death. They called it Sinosauropteryx prima. On its own, the skeleton was interesting but not astonishing. A slender, fast, two-legged hunter, built for chasing small prey along the lakeshore. What stopped the world was the halo around it. Running down the back of its neck, along its spine, and out the length of its long tail was a dark fringe, a border of fine filaments, standing off the bone like the nap on worn velvet. This was the thing nobody had ever seen before. Sinosauropteryx became the first dinosaur that was not a bird to be found, with direct fossil evidence of a feathery covering, not scales, not skin alone. A coat of simple hair-like fibres, preserved as a shadow in the stone, framing the animal it once kept warm. Look closely at what those filaments were and were not. They were not the broad, vanned flight feathers of a living pigeon. They had no central shaft splitting into a flat, interlocking web. They were simpler than that, closer to a scattering of stiff bristles or the down on a newly hatched chick. But they were the raw material. They were the first honest proof that the line between dinosaur and bird was blurrier and softer than anyone had drawn it. And once you have seen one, you start to ask where else they hid. If a small hunter by a Chinese lake wore a fringe of fibres, who else did? How far did this covering reach across the family? The Jehol rock, so generous with soft tissue, kept answering. Species after species came out of that ash, and many of them wore some version of the same coat. For a while, you could tell yourself a comfortable story. Feathers, or the fuzz that came before feathers, belonged to the small ones. To the swift, light, bird-like hunters at the far twig of the family tree, the ones already halfway to flight. The big predators, the true monsters, surely stayed bare. Surely a giant meat-eater kept the classic reptile skin scaled and grim and dry. It was easy to believe. It felt right. The ash had other plans. In 2012, scientists described a new giant from the same Yixian rocks of Liaoning, from a layer about 125 million years old. They named it Yutyrannus huali, a name that carries the meaning of beautiful feathered tyrant. And beautiful is not a word usually spent on an animal like this. Yutyrannus was a tyrannosaur, a heavy, deep-jawed cousin of the lineage that would later produce the most famous predator of all. Take its measure, and you feel the shift. Yutyrannus ran to roughly 30 feet from snout to tail tip. It weighed something near 3,000 pounds, close to 1.5 tons of muscle and bone on 2 legs. Hold that in your mind. This was no crow-sized glider clinging to a branch. This was a bulk you could not have wrapped your arms around, an animal taller than the ceiling of an ordinary room, and it was covered in filaments. Not one, but 3 separate skeletons came out of the ground carrying the same evidence, long fibres preserved against the bone. That number matters because 3 tellings of the same story are far harder to explain away than one. Yutyrannus stands as the largest dinosaur ever found with direct fossil evidence of a feathery coat. It outweighed the previous record holder, a strange clawed animal called Anchiornis, by something like 40 times over. Picture the covering itself. These were not neat plumes. They were long, simple strands described by the researchers as closer to shaggy fur than to the tidy feathers of a bird. Imagine a coat more like the rough hair of a wild ox than the sleek wing of an eagle. Run your hand along it in your mind and you would feel coarse threads, not smooth veins. On an animal the size of Yutyrannus, that fuzz would have hung in a ragged mane across the back and flanks. That single find forced a redrawing overnight. For generations, artists had painted the great tyrant lizards as bare-skinned brutes, all scale and sinew. Now here was a 1.5-ton tyrannosaur wearing a coat. The old silhouette, so confident and so familiar, had to be sketched again from the outline up. If the giants could be fuzzy, then the fuzz was no longer a quirk of the small. It was a serious feature of the group, big and small alike. Why would a predator that size grow such a coat at all? A tiny animal loses heat fast, so insulation makes obvious sense for the small. A 3,000-pound hunter has the opposite problem, holding heat in a large body. Here the honest answer is that we are reasoning, not reading it off the stone. The leading idea points to climate. This corner of the early Cretaceous may have run cooler than the steamy world we often imagine, and a shaggy coat would have held a warmth against that chill. Display is possible too, a covering that signalled to rivals and mates. The fossils give us the fuzz. The reason for it we infer, carefully and hold loosely. There is another honest limit worth naming here, before you carry the idea too far. The filaments on Yutyrannus are preserved in patches, not as a complete head-to-tail suit. When you see a fully feathered giant in a modern painting, part of that is reconstruction filling the gaps between the preserved zones. It is a reasonable filling, but it is a choice, and a careful viewer keeps that in mind. The evidence is real. The full coverage is inference laid over it, and this raises a question that reaches beyond the tyrants. It reaches all the way back down the tree. If both the small bird-like hunters and the massive tyrannosaurs carried this covering, how deep did it go? Was it invented once, early, and passed down to nearly everyone, or did it spring up again and again in separate branches? To answer that, you would need to find the covering somewhere far from the meat-eaters, on the other great limb of the dinosaur family, and for a long time nobody had. Then the search moved north and west, out of China, and into the cold heart of Siberia. Follow that thread to a place on the Orlov River, in the Transbaikal region of eastern Russia, where a fossil site called Kulinda gives up its dead. The rock here belongs to the Jurassic, older than the Chinese lakes you have been standing beside. Like Johol, this was once a volcanic lakeshore. Like Johol, ash fell in killing sheets and buried the living where they lay. When paleontologists dug in, they found not one animal but a graveyard, 6 skulls, several hundred partial skeletons, a whole population entombed in a single grey catastrophe. The animal they named was Calindrodromius zabaikalicus, described in 2014. And here is why it changed everything about the question of how deep the coat ran. Calindrodromius was not a predator. It was a small plant-eater, a light two-legged runner built to crop low vegetation and flee. In the language of the family tree it was an ornithischian, a member of the great bird-hipped branch that had split away from the meat-eaters long before. This is the branch that would later grow the horned faces and the armoured backs and the duck-billed herds. It's about as far from a bird as a dinosaur can get. Calindrodromius wore filaments. Study one of these little skeletons and the story's written right there on a single body. Down the tail and along the shins you find scales. Plain, familiar reptile scales, pebbled and overlapping exactly what the old picture promised. But climb up the limbs, across the back and over the head, and the covering changes. There the scales give way to bristles, and then to something more elaborate still. Complex branch structures, filaments that split from a base into several strands like the ribs of a tiny feather. Hold that image, because it is the whole point. One animal, a humble plant-eater, carrying scales on its legs and feather-like structures on its body at the same time. Scale and fuzz side by side on the same skin. You did not have to choose between the reptile and the bird. Here was a creature that was quietly both, on a single Siberian afternoon before the ash came down. This is the find that lets scientists ask the boldest version of the question out loud. If a bird-hipped plant-eater in Jurassic Siberia grew branched filaments, and the meat-eaters in China grew them too, then perhaps the capacity for this covering was not a late invention of one clever branch. Perhaps it sat near the very base of the dinosaur family, present in the common ancestor of nearly all of them. Perhaps the default dinosaur was never truly bare. Perhaps scales in some lineages were the thing that came later, a covering regrown over a body that had once been fuzzed. It is a beautiful idea. And it is exactly here that you should slow down and be honest with yourself about what we know. Because that grand conclusion rests, for the ornithischian side, on a very small foundation Chilindrodromius is, at present, the strongest single case for feather-like structures on the bird-hipped branch. One site, one kind of animal, one remarkable pattern preserved by one lucky fall of ash. From that single data point comes the sweeping claim that a feathery covering may be ancestral across all of Dinosauria. That is a long inference drawn from a short line of evidence, and the scientist who made it know that better than anyone. There is a rival explanation, and it is not weak. It says that these filamentous coats did not come from one deep ancestor at all. Instead, the ability to grow them arose more than once, independently, in separate branches, the way the ability to fly appeared separately in birds and bats and insects. Under this view, the meat-eaters grew their fibres on their own, and Chilindrodromius grew its own set on the far side of the family, and the resemblance is convergence rather than inheritance. Both stories fit the current fossils. Neither can yet be ruled out. So this is the shape of the debate as it stands, and it is worth holding both halves at once. On one hand, the feathered dinosaur is no longer a fringe idea or an artist's flourish. The evidence is direct, repeated, and spread across wildly different animals, from a small lakeshore hunter to a 1.5-ton tyrant to a humble Siberian grazer. That much is solid ground. You can stand on it. On the other hand, the exact map of where the covering came from, and how many times it was invented, and which branches kept it and which lost it, remains an open and living argument. The certainty is real. The certainty just does not extend as far as the boldest headline. That mixture, firm evidence wrapped around honest uncertainty, is what good paleontology actually feels like from the inside. It is not a single triumphant reveal. It is a slow accumulation of slabs, each one narrowing the range of things that could be true, none of them closing the question completely. The ash beds of Liaoning and Siberia narrowed that range enormously. They took the bare, scaly reptile of the old books and replaced it with something stranger and softer, and far more like a living animal you could imagine shivering in the cold. Come back one last time to that early Cretaceous lake, and let yourself see it as the fossils now allow. Sinosauropteryx trots along the shore, a fringe of fibres standing up along its spine and running out to the tip of its tail, catching the low light like the fuzz on a caterpillar's back. Somewhere in the trees, a shaggy Yutyrannus moves through the ferns, its coarse coat ragged across a body the length of a delivery truck, warm against the cooler air. And far to the north, on another lakeshore in another age, a small Chilindrodromius crops at low plants, scaled along its shins and feathered across its back, unaware that it carries one of the great clues about who dinosaurs really were. None of these animals knew they were arguments. They were simply alive, feeding and fleeing and keeping warm, wearing coverings that suited their bodies and their world. It took the patient falling of volcanic ash to freeze them mid-life, and it took electron microscopes and careful eyes many millions of years later to read what the ash had saved. What that reading gave us was texture. The true surface of a dinosaur, the down and the bristles and the branched filaments, the coarse mane and the fine fringe, all of it recovered from stone that most people would have walked past without a glance. You know now that a dinosaur could be fuzzy. You know it could be shaggy at 1.5 tons, and feathered while still a bird-hipped plant-eater, and that the neat wall between scale and feather was never really a wall at all. That is a profound remaking of the animal, achieved not by imagination but by evidence pulled directly out of the ground. And yet, for all that the ash preserved, it left the deepest question almost untouched. A fringe of filaments tells you the shape and the surface of a covering. It does not at first glance tell you its shade. You could stand over Sinosauropteryx in its slab and know it had a striped tail, and still not know whether those stripes were black or brown, or some colour with no name. To see a dinosaur fully, you would need to move past the outline of its coat and into the pigment locked inside it. Hold the weight in your mind first, because the weight is what cracked the old picture open. For years, feathers belonged to small things. The filament-bearing fossils came from animals you might have lifted in cupped hands, quick hunters no heavier than a fox. Feathers, the reasoning went, were a small body trait, a covering for creatures that ran warm and shed heat fast, the way a sparrow burns through the cold. Then a predator arrived that weighed as much as a small car. Its name is Yutyrannus huali, and it was named in 2012 by Xu Xing and his colleagues. The bones came from the Yixian formation of Liaoning in northeastern China. That is rock laid down about 125 million years ago. 3 skeletons were recovered, not one. An adult and 2 smaller individuals pressed into stone that also held the faint, carbon-dark ghosts of long filaments. Now the numbers are slowly, because they are the reason paleontologists sat up. Yutyrannus stretched roughly 30 feet from snout to tail tip. Stand it beside you, and its hip would rise well above the top of your head. It carried close to 1.5 tons of body, somewhere near 3,000 pounds of muscle and bone and gut, balanced over 2 walking legs. That makes it the largest dinosaur ever found with direct fossil evidence of feathers, not inferred feathers, not a covering borrowed from some smaller cousin further down the family tree, actual filament impressions lying in the rock beside the skeleton where the animal itself had left them. Picture the excavation. A predator the length of a delivery truck split across 3 separate slabs of grey stone. On those slabs, alongside the great jaw and the clawed hands, ran the impressions of filaments. Not the neat, branched, zippered flight feathers you know from a pigeon's wing. Something simpler. Long, soft strands described by the researchers as closer to shaggy fur than to plumage. Run your fingers through a thick winter coat on a dog and you are close to it. A coarse, insulating pelt draped over an animal that could have looked a horse in the eye. To feel how far up the scale this pushes things, measure Yutyrannus against the animal it dethroned. Before it, the heaviest dinosaur with feather evidence was Psittacosaurus. That was another Liaoning creature, a strange long-clawed plant-eater wearing its own coat of simple filaments. Psittacosaurus was a modest animal, the kind of body you could imagine standing quietly in a doorway. Yutyrannus outweighed it by roughly 40 times. 40. Set 40 of the smaller animal on one pan of a scale, and a single Yutyrannus would settle the beam by itself. Sit with that multiplier, because the multiplier is the whole point. A jump of 40 in body mass is not a small correction. It is the difference between something you could carry and something that could knock you flat with its tail. Feathers had been filed under small and quick and warm-blooded. Now the record holder was a giant. The neat rule bent, then broke. If a 3,000-pound tyrannosauroid wore a coat of filaments, then the covering was not a small animal trait after all. It was something that could persist far up the size range, on bodies large enough to shake the ground. And these were true tyrannosaurs in the broad sense. Yutyrannus sat near the base of the same great predator lineage that would later produce the famous giants of the North American West. So the discovery did more than add one shaggy animal to the catalogue. It forced a question about the whole group. Illustrators who had drawn scaly, bare-skinned tyrannosaurs for a century suddenly had to consider the alternative. Perhaps some of these hunters, at some sizes in some climates, went about their lives wrapped in fuzz. Before I follow that question, one quiet request. If this slow walk through deep time is doing its work, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Then let your attention settle again, and we will go back to the fossils. Because Yutyrannus was not the only animal rewriting the rules. Travel north and west, out of China and into the cold heart of eastern Siberia, to a place called the Kulinda locality, on the banks of the Orlov River. The rock there belongs to the Eukarate Formation, and it dates to the Jurassic, older than the Liaoning beds. Out of that ground came a small plant-eating dinosaur named Kulindodromius zabaykalicus. It was described in 2014 by Pascal Godefroy and his colleagues. This animal matters for a reason its modest size hides. Kulindodromius was not a predator at all. It was an ornithischian, a member of the great bird-hipped branch of plant-eaters, far removed from the meat-eating theropods that had supplied nearly every feathered fossil until then, and it too wore something more than scales. The site itself is a marvel of preservation, and again the Count tells the story. From that single Siberian locality, researchers recovered 6 skulls. Around them lay several hundred partial skeletons, hundreds of small bodies gathered in one place buried together. The likely reason is written into the rock. This was a volcanically active landscape, a lakeshore near mountains that breathed ash. Picture a fine grey fall settling over shallow water and mud, thick enough to smother a whole population of small animals at once, then to seal them. The same ash that ended their lives held their outline still for 160 million years. Cylindrodromeus was a small, 2-legged herbivore, a quick and lightly built runner. On its tail and its lower legs, the fossils preserved ordinary scales, the kind you would expect on any reptile. But higher up, on the limbs and the back and the head, the picture changed. There sat short bristles, and on the upper legs more complex structures, filaments that branched, splitting from a base into finer strands. On one animal, on one preserved leg, you can trace the transition with your eye. Plain scales near the shin, branching, feather-like coverings higher up, scales and filaments side by side on the same body. That single fossil carried an argument. If a plant-eating ornithischian, sitting on a completely different branch from the theropods, also grew branching filaments, then the covering might be far older and far more widespread than anyone had assumed. Perhaps some form of fuzzy integument was ancestral across the dinosaurs as a whole, present near the root of the family and inherited down many lines. That is the tempting reading. It is also, honestly, an inference drawn from a single locality. The alternative is that such coverings evolved more than once, independently in separate lineages. The Calinda animals lean the argument one way, they do not close it. So return now to the heavyweights, and to the question their size forces on us. Why would a 3,000-pound predator keep a coat of filaments at all? On a small animal, the answer is easy. Small bodies lose heat quickly, and a covering holds it in. But a giant is a different problem. Large bodies hold their warmth simply by being large, the way a great pot of water cools far slower than a cup. For an animal the mass of Yutyrannus, overheating is usually the greater danger, not chilling, so the coat needs another explanation. Here the researchers offered a careful suggestion, and it is worth marking it clearly as suggestion, not proven fact. The Yixian environment at that time may have been cooler than the steamy world we often imagine for the age of dinosaurs. In a colder regional climate, even a large animal might benefit from insulation, a shaggy pelt earning its keep against the chill. That is one reading of filaments, another is display, a covering that signalled something to rivals or to mates, the way a coat of fur can also be a coat of meaning. The truth is that a flattened fossil cannot easily tell you which. We can measure the filaments, we can weigh the animal, we cannot yet ask it why it was warm. And there is a further honest gap in the picture. The filament impressions on Yutyrannus are real, but they do not cover the whole skeleton. They survive in patches on parts of the body wherever the rock happened to preserve them. To say the entire animal was feathered, head to tail, is an extension of the evidence, a reasonable guess rather than a direct observation. It may well be right. But the difference between what the stone shows and what we reconstruct around it is exactly the difference a careful mind keeps in view. Still, step back from the caveats and the picture that remains is astonishing. 1.5 tons of predator 30 feet long wrapped in filaments like coarse fur. A small Siberian herbivore, one of hundreds, wearing scales and branching fuzz on the very same leg. The old clean rule that feathers were the property of small and bird-like things lies broken on the quarry floor. The covering had reached the giants, it had reached the plant-eaters, it had spread across the family in ways the first fossils never hinted at. You could now describe a great deal about these animals with real confidence. Their length in feet, their weight in pounds, the date of the rock that held them, even the drape of the filaments across the skin, coarse here, branching there. The outline of the living creature was filling in, line by line, from evidence rather than guesswork. The shape of the coat was becoming knowable. Texture was one revolution, yet a harder question waited: the true colour of a living dinosaur. Texture was one revolution, yet a hard question waited: the true colour of a living dinosaur. For most of the history of this science, that question sat behind glass, untouchable. Bone gives you shape. Skin gives you texture. Colour, nearly everyone agreed, had drained away with the flesh long ago, so the old paintings simply guessed. Muddy greens, elephant greys, the flat browns of a reptile house. Then a researcher held a fossil feather under a powerful microscope, and the old certainty cracked open. Packed inside the dark filament lay tiny shapes, lined up in orderly rows. You are looking at melanosomes, the pigment sacs of a creature that breathed roughly 155 million years ago. They are among the smallest structures any fossil has ever surrendered. For years nobody knew what they were. Under weaker lenses the little bodies looked like grime, or like the fossilized remains of bacteria that had fed on a rotting carcass. Rows of them, some sausage-shaped, some round, threaded through feather and filament. The safe reading was decay. Microbes are roughly that size, and they gather on anything that dies in mud. So the specks were logged as contamination, the ordinary residue of death, and quietly set aside. For a long stretch of years, the true colour of dinosaurs slept inside a misfiled detail. The correction came from living birds. Look inside a modern feather, a crow's black wing, or a robin's rust chest, and you find the same tiny bodies, in the same tidy ranks. They are not invaders. They are the animal's own pigment machinery, the sacs that carry melanin and lock colour into growing feathers. And here is the part that reopened the case. The shape of a melanosome tracks the colour it makes. Long, slender, sausage-shaped sacs carry the pigment that reads as black and dark grey. Small, round, ball-shaped sacs carry the pigment that reads as chestnut and reddish-brown. The geometry is a fingerprint. You can hold it between two fingers of thought and feel the difference. So the reasoning ran backward, from the living to the dead. If the little shapes in the fossil match the shapes in a crow, they are not bacteria. They are melanosomes, still holding their form after the pigment itself has vanished. And if their shape encodes colour in a living bird, it may still encode colour in a fossil. The specks that everyone had thrown away were, in fact, a faded set of instructions. Under the electron microscope, packed in their rows, they waited to be read like beads on a string. The first animal read this way was small, fast and already famous. Sinosauropteryx, the little predator from the ashy lake country of northern China, the first non-bird dinosaur ever found wearing a fringe of filaments down its spine. When researchers surveyed its feathers under the microscope in that nature study near the start of the 2010s, they found melanosomes crowded along the tail and back. The shapes were not uniform. In some bands the sacs were round and dense, the ones that carry reddish-brown. In the gaps between, the pattern thinned or changed. A picture began to surface, the way an image lifts slowly out of a developing tray in a darkroom. What surfaced was a striped tail. Alternating bands ran down its length, pale rings against rings of chestnut and reddish-brown, a barber pole of colour drawn from pigment shape alone. A similar reddish crest ran along the animal's back. For the first time, a dinosaur had a coat described not by an artist's mood, but by the microscopic evidence in its own body. You could stand this creature in your mind and know, within honest limits, that its tail was banded like a lemur's, that its spine carried a rust-coloured ridge. The guesswork of a century had a rival at last. The picture kept filling in. A later look at 3 Sinosauropteryx specimens found the colouring did not stop at the body. It ran up onto the face, dark pigment gathered around the eyes in a band, a raccoon-like mask across a dinosaur no bigger than a house cat. That detail matters more than it first seems. A mask around the eyes is a functional pattern in living animals. It can cut glare. It can break up the shape of a face for a hunter watching from cover. This was not decoration invented to sell a poster. It was a working feature, written in pigment, recovered from stone. Now hold that method still and turn up its ambition. Sinosauropteryx gave colour to a tail and a face, patches of a body. But could you paint an entire animal, head to claw, from the evidence alone? That was the harder prize, and it fell to a four-winged creature from an older world, the late Jurassic forests of what is now China. Its name is Anchiornis huxleyi, from the Tiaojishan beds, dated to roughly 155 to 160 million years ago. It was about the size of a chicken, with feathers on all four limbs, a small glider or near glider moving through a canopy of ferns and conifers. To reconstruct the whole animal, researchers did something almost forensic. Instead of sampling a patch or two, they gridded the fossil. They took melanosome samples from 29 separate places across the single, flattened skeleton, from crown to wing to leg, mapping the pigment shapes region by region, as a technician works a scene square by square. Each sample answered one small question. What colour, most likely, was this square inch of the living bird? Laid side by side, the 29 answers stopped being points and became a portrait. This was the first dinosaur to have its entire body colour reconstructed from physical evidence rather than imagination. And the portrait is specific. The body was mostly dark grey, from the long sausage-shaped melanosomes packed through the contour feathers. The wings were the surprise. The coverts, the smaller feathers layering the front of the wing, came out white, and the long flight feathers were tipped in black, so that each wing carried rows of dark spots along a pale field. The effect is strikingly like a woodpecker's wing, that same crisp black and white barring, and over the head sat a splash of reddish-brown, a rusty crown speckling down the face, a dark grey body, spangled wings, a red cap. A chicken-sized woodpecker in essence laid out under laboratory light for the first time in 160 million years. Sit with how strange that is. You're looking at an animal no human ever saw alive, whose flesh vanished before the first flowering plant opened, and yet you can describe the pattern on its wing with more confidence than a witness usually gets. Not because anyone glimpsed it, because the pigment sacs kept their shape, and shape kept the colour, and the colour was patient enough to wait. The reddish crown of Anchiornis is not a painter's flourish. It is a reading, taken from 29 points on a body that has been dead since the Jurassic, 2 animals down, and both are feathered, both close to the bird line. That raised an obvious doubt. Maybe this trick only worked on feathers, only on the dinosaurs already halfway to sparrows. What about the great scaly branch of the family, the horned and beaked plant-eaters with no plumage at all? Could you ever paint one of those from evidence? The answer arrived on a small relative of the horned giants, a parrot-beaked plant-eater called Psittacosaurus, an early cousin far down the line that would one day produce Triceratops. One specimen, exquisitely preserved, carried its colouring across the whole body, dark along the top and pale beneath. Researchers mapped the pigment and found a clean gradient. The back and upper flanks were richly pigmented. The belly and the underside of the tail were light. This arrangement has a name in living animals. It is called countershading, and you can see it on a deer, a shark, a garden robin. Dark above, light below, the single most common camouflage scheme on Earth. Finding it painted onto a dinosaur from its own pigment map was quietly astonishing. Countershading works by fighting the sun. Light falls from above, so an animal's back is naturally brightened and its belly thrown into shadow. That gradient of light and dark is exactly what an eye uses to read a solid, rounded shape. Countershading cancels it. The pigment darkens the parts the sun brightens and pales, the parts the sun shades, and the two effects erase each other. The animal flattens. Its own body stops casting the visual signal that says here is something solid, something to eat. It is a coat that unpaints your shadow. But a pattern on a flat fossil is one thing. Proving it worked as camouflage is another, and this is where the researchers did something you rarely see in paleontology. They built the animal. A paleo artist sculpted a full-size, three-dimensional model of Psittacosaurus and painted it precisely to the fossil's own pigment map. Dark where the evidence said dark. pale where the evidence said pale. Then they took the model outdoors and photographed it under different kinds of real light to watch how the shading behaved when actual sun and actual shadow fell across a solid body. The fossil had given a flat blueprint. The model turned the blueprint back into a creature you could walk around. The test told them where the animal had lived. The exact placement of the light-to-dark transition on a counter-shaded body is tuned to its lighting. An animal of the open plains under a high harsh sun needs the changeover high on the flank. An animal of the forest floor under soft light broken and scattered by a canopy needs it lower and more gradual. When the researchers matched the model's own gradient against different lighting, the pattern fit a forest, a place of dappled, broken light, not an open plain. The pigment was not just telling them the animal's colour, it was telling them the animal's home. Think about the depth of that inference, all of it hanging from microscopic granules in stone. From a smear of pigment, a colour. From the colour, a camouflage scheme. From the exact shape of that scheme, a habitat, a world of filtered green light and moving shadow under Cretaceous trees, a little parrot-beaked plant-eater, standing still in the broken light, harder to see than its size should allow. Not because a painter imagined a jungle for it, but because its own body, read carefully, described the light it was built to hide in. If you are finding a strange comfort in this, in the slow turning of dead granules into living animals, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. The Quiet Company helps this kind of patient work continue. So here is where the evidence has carried us. A striped masked little hunter from an ashy lake shore. A grey-bodied glider with woodpecker wings and a red crown. A parrot-beaked plant-eater shaded to vanish in forest light. 3 dinosaurs painted not from mood but from measurement. The first true colours ever pulled from the deep past. It feels like a door thrown open, and in many ways it is. But an honest account has to close some of that door again, because the method has real limits, and the scientists who built it are the first to name them. Start with the deepest assumption. The whole reading rests on one bridge, that the relationship between a melanosome's shape and its colour has held steady across more than 150 million years of evolution. In a living crow, round sacs mean rust and long sacs mean black. The method assumes that same rule held in a Jurassic glider and a Cretaceous plant-eater, animals separated from any living bird by an ocean of time. It is a reasonable assumption. Living reptiles and birds share the machinery, and the pattern is consistent across the birds we can check. But it is an assumption, calibrated against the present, and it is not the same as watching the animal in the sun, and the readings themselves are spoken in probability, not proclamation. When the researchers said reddish-brown for the crown of Anchiornis, they did not mean a paint chip. They meant that the melanosome shapes in that region most closely match the shapes that produce reddish-brown in living feathers, with a certain confidence, leaving room for error at the edges. The honesty is built into the science. These are the most probable colours, drawn carefully from the evidence, not photographs smuggled out of the Jurassic. A calm reading of the data, offered with its uncertainty attached. There is also the matter of pigment that leaves no fossil at all. Melanin is durable, and its sacs keep their shape, which is exactly why this method works. But melanin is only one source of animal colour. The brilliant reds and yellows of a cardinal or a parrot often come from other pigments, carotenoids drawn from food, and from structural colour, the microscopic architecture that makes a blue jay blue with no blue pigment at all. Much of that machinery does not survive as a readable fossil the way a melanosome does. So a melanosome map can miss whole regions of an animal's palette. The greys and blacks and rusty browns come through. A flash of yellow or a structural blue could be lost without a trace. And then there is the plainest limit of all, one of sheer number. Count the dinosaurs painted this way, and you are still counting on one hand and part of another, a handful of species, nearly all of them small, nearly all from a few extraordinary fossil beds where soft tissue survived at all. The lakes of China, the odd exceptional slab, the tyrant kings and the long-necked giants, The horned herds and the armoured tanks, the overwhelming majority of the dinosaur world, remain uncoloured by evidence. For almost every dinosaur you can name, the honest answer to what colour it was is still that nobody knows. That is worth holding without disappointment. What the melanosome work proved is not that we now know every colour. It proved that dinosaur colour is knowable at all, that it left a physical trace, that the question is a scientific one, and not merely a matter of taste. A door that everyone had assumed was locked forever turned out to have a key, and the key was hiding in specks once thrown away as dirt. The rest of the house is still dark, but you know now that the lights can, in principle, be turned on, one careful animal at a time, and notice what these methods reach and what they cannot. They reach the pattern of a coat, the banding of a tail, the shading that hid a body in the trees. They reach it because pigment sacs are hard little structures that keep their shape, the way a footprint keeps a shape after the foot is gone. But a living animal is far more than the arrangement of its melanin. Colour is the surface. Beneath it lie all the things that pigment cannot record, the soft parts, the behaviours, the choices a creature made from one breath to the next. That is the frontier these bright reconstructions run up against. You can say, with real evidence, that Anchiornis wore a rusty crown and spangled wings. You cannot yet say what it did with them, whether it flashed them at a rival or a mate, or held them still and dull to hide. You can say Psittacosaurus was shaded to vanish in forest light. You cannot say what it feared in that forest, or how it moved, or what sound it made when the light went wrong. The paint is real. The living animal underneath it stays mostly in shadow. Stand for a while under a different canopy. The forest around you is warm and close, and the air barely moves. This is Liaoning, in what will one day be northeastern China, about 125 million years ago. Above you, tall conifers and broad ginkgos hold up a broken ceiling of needles and leaves. Light falls through it in coins and thin blades. It shifts whenever the branches stir, pale gold sliding across the ground. Nothing here is evenly lit. The whole forest floor is a lattice of bright patches and deep shade. Below the trees lies a lake, wide and quiet, its surface the colour of poured pewter. Ferns crowd the margins in soft green ranks. Cycads fan low to the ground, stiff and dark. Dragonflies stitch the warm air above the reeds. Out across the water, a fish breaks the surface and vanishes again. The stillness has real weight to it. You can feel the day pressing down warm on your shoulders and the back of your neck. This is the Juhol world, one of the richest windows into deep time ever opened, and it owes that richness to something you can almost taste on the wind. Under the green smell of fern and resin, faint and mineral, there is ash. The hills that ring this basin are not sleeping. They are volcanoes, and they wake often. Every few generations one of them clears its throat. A dark column climbs into the sky and leans with the wind. Then the fine grey dust begins to come down. It settles on the leaves without a sound. It films the surface of the lake. It sifts into the moss and gathers in the folds of the ferns like the first thin snow of a season that has no snow. Most of these ashfalls are gentle. The animals shake the dust from their backs and go on feeding. But now and then an eruption is larger, and the air itself turns to poison. Fine particles clog the lake. Whole communities of small animals die where they stand or swim, and the ash keeps falling, and it buries them fast. That speed is the gift. Bury a body slowly, and scavengers and rot take everything soft. Bury it in hours, sealed under airless mud and dust, and the soft things stay. Here, feathers stay. Skin stays. The last meal inside a small predator's belly stays, held in place for 100 million years. Imagine one of the heavier ashfall mornings. The light goes strange first, thickening to a dim brass. The sun a pale disk you can stare straight into. The forest calls fall silent. The dust comes steadily now, coating your arms, settling in the corners of your eyes, tasting of struck flint on your tongue. Animals cough and stumble toward the water and find it fouled. By the time the sky clears, a new pale layer has sealed the forest floor and everything caught beneath it has already begun its long wait in the dark. So the forest around you is beautiful and dangerous in the same breath. It is a place that preserves its dead with terrible care. Keep that in mind as the living things begin to move. Watch the low ferns near the water. Something small is hunting there. It is Sinosauropteryx, a slender two-legged predator no longer than your arm, quick and low to the ground. It moves in short darting runs, freezing between them. Down its back and along its long tapering tail runs a fringe of simple filaments, not true flat feathers, but a soft downy coat. And that coat is coloured. The tail carries bands, alternating pale and rich reddish-brown, ringing it from base to tip. Across its face, around each eye, lies a darker patch, like the mask of a raccoon. You would know that face at once, though no living thing wears it now. None of that colour is decoration for its own sake. Look again at the light. The forest floor is a jumble of glare and gloom, sun coins scattered over shadow. A small animal standing in that clutter needs to disappear into it, so watch how the little hunter is painted. Its back is dark, its belly pale. That gradient is not an accident. Think about what light does to a solid body. The sun comes from above, so the top of any rounded animal is lit bright and the underside falls into its own shadow. That shading is what your eye reads as shape. It is how you tell a body from the flat world behind it. But paint the back dark and the belly light in just the right measure, and the two effects cancel. The bright underside erases the shadow. The dark top swallows the glare. The animal flattens. It stops looking like a thing that casts a shadow and starts looking like part of the leaf litter. Predators lose it. Prey lose it. In this broken forest light, a dark back over a pale belly is a coat of near invisibility. The mask does its own work. A round dark eye is one of the most legible shapes in nature. The thing a hunter's gaze snaps to first. Smear a band of dark colour across it. Break its outline against the face, and the eye stops shouting. It sinks into the pattern. The reddish stripes on the tail help too, chopping the long, clean line of the body into pieces the eye struggles to reassemble. This is not a costume. It is a survival strategy worn on the skin, tuned exactly to a forest lit like this one. You can see the same logic on a very different animal grazing at the wood's edge. Picture a squat plant-eater with a blunt parrot beak, low to the ground, cropping at the ferns. Its back is dark, its underside pale, the shading blended from spine to belly with real precision. That pattern belongs to a forest, not a plain. On open ground under a high, bare sun, countershading like this would fail. It only works where the light comes down soft and broken through leaves, exactly the light falling around you now. Read the colouring, and it tells you the habitat. The animal is painted for this shade. Now step back through much older time into a forest that stood on this same land long before the lake you see. Tens of millions of years earlier, in the late Jurassic, a smaller feathered creature moved through broken light much like this. It was Anchiornis, about the size of a chicken, with long feathers trailing from all four limbs. Its body was a dark slate grey. Its wings were barred, white coverts each dipped in black, lead in neat rows. On its head sat a crown of reddish-brown, flecked and freckled down the face. If you glimpsed it among the ferns, you might think for a moment of a woodpecker, small and sharply marked, working its way along a low branch. That older forest and this Jehol lake are separated by a vast gulf of years, but the light in them was much the same, and the animals answered the light in much the same way, with patterns broken and barred and counter-shaded, tuned to a world of shifting shade. The forest keeps setting the same problem. Again and again, the small and the hunted arrive at the same answer. Not everything here hides. Somewhere back among the larger trees moves a giant, and the ground registers its weight. This is Yutyrannus, a tyrannosaur roughly 30 feet long and heavier than a small car, the largest animal ever found, still carrying clear evidence of feathers on its body. Its coat is nothing like the neat plumage of the little four-winged glider. It is a shaggy pelt of long, coarse filaments, closer to the rough hair of a wild ox than to anything on a bird's wing. On an animal this size, in a climate cooler than you might expect of dinosaur country, that fuzz reads less as display and more as warmth. A big body in a chilly forest keeps its heat with a coat. Even the monsters of the Jehol wear their feathers here, so the picture fills in around you. The pewter lake, the broken gold light, the masked little hunter frozen in the ferns, the parrot-beaked grazer painted for the shade, the shaggy giant threading between the trunks. Insects drone. The water laps. The forest breathes its warm, resinous breath. And over all of it, so fine you stop noticing, the ash keeps drifting down, dusting the leaves, greying the moss, waiting. That is the strange bargain of this place. The same falling ash that made the forest a graveyard also made it a portrait gallery. It caught these animals in the act of living and held them, coat and colour and last meal intact until they could be read again. The bands on a tail, the mask across a face, the dark back shading to a pale belly. None of it was invented. It was recovered, grain by grain, from stone that fell out of the sky. And so, out of ash and lake bed and long dark time, an animal steps back into the light, coloured and textured and precisely lit, standing in a forest you could almost walk into. For all these painted certainties, a great deal about the living animal stays genuinely unknown. For all these painted certainties, a great deal about the living animal stays genuinely unknown. You have followed colour out of crushed pigment. You have watched feathers lift from volcanic ash. Yet whole rooms of the animal are still dark. Some of the most stubborn questions sit surprisingly close to the bone. In fact, one of them begins inside a single broken thigh. Picture a quiet laboratory bench and a fragment of Tyrannosaurus rex. The bone came from Montana, from a giant catalogued as specimen MQR 1125. That animal walked, hunted, and died about 68 million years ago. For most of the history of this science, you would have treated such bone as pure stone. Mineral through and through, from the outer wall to the marrow cavity. Nothing soft was thought able to survive that gulf of time. Then, in 2005, a paleontologist named Mary Schweitzer reported something that stopped the room. Her team had dissolved the hard mineral from a piece of that femur in a weak acid bath. When the rock chemistry washed away, it did not leave a scatter of dust. It left something soft, something transparent, flexible, and faintly springy under the tools. Thin hollow tubes branched inside the residue, the way small blood vessels branch. Out of a bone many tens of millions of years old came shapes you could actually stretch. Imagine watching that happen at the bench. Solid dinosaur bone goes into the acid as a dense grey chip. Slowly the mineral gives up its grip and clouds the liquid. What remains is pliable, clinging to the forceps like a strand of wet thread. When the tips close and lift, a translucent branching structure comes free of the solution. Its outline is the outline of a vessel, held for a span of time the mind can barely frame. Nobody had expected anything like it to still exist. Alongside those tubes, the team described a fibrous matrix, not a smear, but a fabric, elastic enough to spring back after it was pressed. There were also tiny round structures set within the vessel walls, reminiscent of cells. You can feel why the finding landed so hard. It seemed to reach past the mineral and touch the tissue itself, and a claim that large draws exactly the scrutiny it should, because the obvious worry arrives fast. Could this soft material be something modern instead? A film of bacteria, a slick biofilm grown inside the porous bone long after the animal was gone? Or laboratory contamination, stray matter that only mimicked ancient tissue? If the vessels were merely young microbial slime shaped like old plumbing, the wonder would collapse. So the real test was never the first image. The test was whether the chemistry could be pinned down. Over the following years, Schweitzer and others went after that chemistry directly. They did not rely on shape alone. They brought in antibodies, molecules that recognize one specific protein and bind to it and nothing else. They used antibodies raised against chicken collagen, against cow elastin, and against ostrich hemoglobin. Each is a molecular key cut for a particular lock. When those keys were introduced to the recovered material, they found their locks and held. Think about what those three animals share. A chicken and an ostrich are living dinosaurs in the broad sense, birds descended from the same great branch. A cow is a distant mammalian cousin with the same deep protein toolkit. If antibodies tuned to their collagen, their elastin, and their hemoglobin all responded to the T-Rex residue that pointed at real, shared proteins. Not random rock, not a stray modern microbe, something built from the same molecular vocabulary as backboned life today. The team did not stop at antibodies either. They layered on high-resolution imaging to map the fine structure. They used diffraction to read how the material scattered a beam and hinted at its internal order. They used spectroscopy to sample its chemical signature, and they used immunohistochemistry to see exactly where the binding occurred within the tissue. Taken together, these independent lines converged on one reading. The vessel walls appear to carry original type 1 collagen, the most common structural protein in animal bone and skin. That is a remarkable place to arrive. It suggests that under rare conditions, fragments of a dinosaur's own building blocks can persist. Not its full genetic code, which stays far out of reach, but pieces of the protein scaffold that held its body together. The soft, stretchable outline is direct laboratory observation. You can see it and touch it. The identity as ancient dinosaur protein is a conclusion, supported now by several separate tests that keep agreeing. And here the honesty of the science matters most. The recovery is real and repeatable in the right specimens. The chemistry has held up across multiple independent methods. Yet the mechanism, the actual reason such material survived, is still being worked out at the bench right now. How do proteins that should degrade in centuries hang on for 68 million years? One line of research points to iron released from blood, forming links that lock the molecules and slow their breakdown, the way a strong preservative stiffens soft tissue. That idea is promising and still under active study, not closed. So you hold two truths at once. Something extraordinary came out of that femur, and the reason it endured is not yet fully explained. That gap is not a failure. It is the frontier drawn plainly, with the known part and the unknown part kept honestly apart. When you next hear that soft tissue was found in a dinosaur, you can carry both halves of the sentence. Now turn from the deep inside of the bone to the surface of the face. There is a question that sounds almost childish, yet it changes the animal you picture. When a Tyrannosaurus closed its mouth, did rows of teeth still show? Or did soft, scaly lips cover them, the way a lizard's jaw hides its teeth at rest? For decades, the film image won by default. Bare fangs, always visible, dripping and exposed. That picture was never really tested against the teeth themselves. In 2023, a team including Thomas Cullen, Derek Larson and Mark Whitten took that test seriously. They did not have a fossil of lips. Lips are soft, and soft things almost never survive as themselves. Instead, they read the hard evidence the teeth leave behind. They compared tooth wear, the condition of the enamel, and the shape of the jaws in living reptiles that keep their teeth covered against those that leave them bare. The logic runs through the enamel. Enamel is tough, but it can dry and crack when exposed to air for long stretches. In living animals that keep their teeth hidden under lips, the enamel stays hydrated and healthy along its length. In animals with permanently exposed teeth, like a crocodile, the outer enamel tends to wear and degrade toward the tip. When the team looked at theropod teeth like those of Tyrannosaurus, the enamel pattern lined up better with the covered lipped condition than with the bare one. They looked at fit as well. In a lipped skull, the teeth of the upper jaw come down inside a soft margin, and the tooth row sits comfortably within the length of the jaw. The theropod skulls they examined matched that arrangement. The teeth were not too long to be sheathed. They fit within a scaly lip line, tucked away when the mouth was shut and revealed only when the jaws swung open to feed. So the animal you should imagine is subtly different from the poster. A Tyrannosaurus at rest, jaws closed, presenting a smooth, scaly muzzle rather than a permanent grin. The teeth are there, formidable and ready. They simply wait behind the lip until the mouth opens. It is a small change in silhouette with a large change in feeling. The monster becomes an animal, its weapons kept where a living predator keeps them. Now hold that conclusion at the right distance. This lipped reading is well supported and increasingly favoured. It rests on careful comparison of wear, enamel and anatomy across many living reptiles. But it is comparison, not a direct fossil of lips. No slab has yet shown the soft lip tissue of a Tyrannosaurus preserved in place. Some researchers still push back and argue for other readings, so you can lean toward lips and still keep the door open. Strong inference is a real kind of knowing, and it is not the same as a photograph. Keep pulling on this thread of skin and covering, because the next question is just as unsettled. What did the outside of a giant Tyrannosaurus actually feel like? Bare scale, like a lizard warmed on rock, or a coat of feathers, like an enormous ground bird? Here the evidence sends two different signals, and the honest answer holds them both. On one side stands Yutyrannus huali, named in 2012 from the Ixian Formation in Liaoning, China. It lived about 125 million years ago, and it belongs to the broad Tyrannosaur family. This was no small dinosaur. It stretched roughly 30 feet long and weighed around 3,000 pounds, more than a large draft horse. 3 skeletons were found, and around them lay long filament impressions. Yutyrannus is the largest dinosaur yet known with direct fossil evidence of feathers. Those filaments were not the neat branched flight feathers of a modern bird. Researchers describe them as simple and shaggy, closer to coarse fur or bristles than to plumage you could preen. Still, they mattered enormously. A predator weighing more than a ton, wearing a filament coat, breaks the old rule that only small dinosaurs bothered with feathers. It suggests that in a cooler regional climate, even a giant might keep insulation, holding warmth against the chill the way a thick pelt does. So if Yutyrannus wore filaments at that size, surely Tyrannosaurus rex did too. Here the second signal arrives, and it points the other way. Where paleontologists have found skin impressions from large tyrannosaurids, patches along the belly, the tail, the neck, the pelvis. Those patches tend to show scales, small pebbled scales, not filaments. The direct skin evidence from the biggest members of the family reads as bare and scaly, at least across the regions preserved. Put the two together and a pattern suggests itself. Perhaps feathers were widespread in the ancestry, present on smaller and cooler climate tyrannosaurs like Yutyrannus. Then, as certain lineages grew truly enormous, they may have shed much of that covering. A very large body holds heat well on its own, the way a barrel of water stays warm long after a cup goes cold. Feathers that keep a small animal warm can become a burden on a giant in a warmer world. Under that reasoning, a full-grown Tyrannosaurus may have been mostly scaly, with feathers reduced or gone. Notice the word may. This is an inference stitched from scattered clues, not a settled observation. No one has yet found a complete Tyrannosaurus rex skin mapped from snout to tail tip that tells you exactly where scale ended and filament began, if it began at all. The scale patches are real and directly measured. The full picture of the animal's covering is reconstructed from those pieces plus the logic of body size and climate. A patch of belly scales does not, by itself, prove a bare back or a naked neck, so the giant stays partly veiled. You can favour a mostly scaly Tyrannosaurus while admitting the map has blank regions. Step back now and look at the whole climb you've made. Think of it as a ladder leaned against the deep past. The bottom rung is bone, hard and abundant, the part that fossilizes best. From bone you read the muscle scars and infer the shape of the living body. A rung up, you reach skin texture, caught as impressions and, in rare cases, as fine mineral templates of the surface. Higher still, you reach feathers, preserved as filaments in the right fine-grained rock. Near the top, you reach colour, coaxed out of the shape of fossilised pigment structures. Every rung on that ladder was tested before anyone stood on it. The muscle reconstructions lean on living birds and crocodilians, the dinosaurs' closest surviving relatives, checked against the ridges real muscles leave on real bone. The skin work was pressed hard enough that some famous mummy patches turned out to be a thin clay mask of the surface, rather than the tissue itself. The feather findings were confirmed across many separate fossils and several dinosaur groups. The colour work was calibrated against pigment structures in modern feathers before anyone named a shade. But some rungs are missing or half-formed, and this segment has walked you across the gaps. The exact chemistry that let a T-Rex vessel survive is still being worked out. The lips are strongly inferred from wear and anatomy, not yet seen as fossil tissue. The covering of a giant Tyrannosaur is stitched from patchy skin and climate logic. Colour has been reconstructed for only a small handful of species, and most dinosaurs keep their palette entirely hidden. The ladder is real, and it is honestly incomplete. That is why the language matters so much when you tell these stories. There is direct evidence, the thing you can measure and photograph and hand to a skeptic, a scale impression, a pigment structure, a branching vessel. There is strong inference, a conclusion built on solid comparison, like the lipped jaw or the muscle map, and there is open debate, where careful people still disagree, like the preservation mechanism or the feathering of the largest adults. A good reconstruction keeps those three labels visible and never lets a dramatic picture stand in as proof. Because the danger is always the vivid image. A life-size model under warm light can feel more certain than any careful paper. A confident painting can quietly harden a guess into a fact in your memory. The Victorians learned this the hard way, when they set a thumb spike on a dinosaur's nose and built a horn out of a hand. The cure is not to stop reconstructing. The cure is to keep saying, out loud, which parts are known and which parts are still a best reading of thin clues. And that habit is exactly what makes this a living field rather than a settled catalogue. Each new specimen can push a rung higher or knock one loose. A single well-preserved skin mapped end to end could finally answer the covering of a giant. A new chemical method could pin the preservation mechanism that still eludes the bench. A fossil that somehow caught the soft margin of a jaw could turn the lipped inference into direct sight. The picture is not frozen, it is being redrawn quietly with every field season. This is the part that is easy to miss when you look at a museum mount. The animal standing there is not a final verdict. It is the current best reading, honest about its own edges, ready to be corrected by the next slab out of the ground. That willingness to be wrong in public and to fix it is the quiet engine under all of it. It is going to keep moving as long as new stone keeps splitting open. So the creatures you have met across this long walk are not fantasies, and they are not finished. Sinosauropteryx with its banded tail, Anchiornis mapped feather by feather, the counter-shaded Psittacosaurus, the shaggy giant Yutyrannus, the lipped and scaly Tyrannosaurus. Each is a careful reading of real evidence, drawn in pencil that can still be erased. The confidence is earned rung by rung. The humility is built into the same ladder. In a warmer chapter of Earth's long history, in what feels now like a mere geological instant, these animals lived in full colour and full motion, and only their faintest echoes reach you. Let the scene widen and soften as you rest here. The lamps of the laboratory dim. The split slabs lie quiet on their trays, holding their filaments and their pigment and their pressed clay skin. The old certainties do not fade away so much as loosen, making room for better ones. What you carry into sleep is not a set of final facts. It is a way of looking, patient and unhurried, that holds evidence and doubt in the same steady hand. Consider the largest tyrannosaur ever found still wearing a covering of its own. Its name is Yutyrannus wali, and it quietly undoes the tidy picture. It was named in 2012 from the Yixian Formation of Liaoning in the northeast of China. It lived about 125 million years ago. It stretched close to 30 feet from snout to the tip of its tail. It weighed something near 3,000 pounds, a hunter the size of a small delivery truck. And across 3 separate slabs of stone, its skeleton came out pressed in long filaments. Those filaments are not the branched flight feathers of a bird. They are simpler, closer to shaggy fur than to plumage. The scientists who studied them reached for almost exactly that comparison, a coarse coat rather than a wing. Yet the fact itself is solid. This is direct fossil evidence, filament impressions lying beside the bones. The heaviest feathered dinosaur yet known was a tyrannosaur, and it was no small thing. Yutyrannus weighed roughly 40 times as much as the previous record holder, a much smaller creature called Bapiosaurus. So you might reasonably expect the giant at the far end of the family, Tyrannosaurus rex itself, to wear the same coat. Here the evidence pushes back. Skin impressions taken from large tyrannosaurids, gathered from other bodies in other places, show scales. Pebbled, reptilian scales, laid out like beadwork with no filaments preserved among them. Now you're holding 2 honest observations that seem to disagree. A feathered tyrannosaur pressed into one slab, a scaly one recorded in another, both real, both direct. The debate lives in that gap, and it is worth walking slowly. On one side, Yutyrannus says that at least some big tyrannosaurs carried a filamentous coat over a body more than a ton in weight. On the other side, scale impressions say that the largest members of the group, or parts of them, met the world with bare, pebbled skin. Neither find is a trick. The question is how both can be true, and what a single animal like the Great Rex actually looked like when it stood breathing on a Cretaceous floodplain. The most common attempt to reconcile them turns on 2 things: body size and climate. Think of how a small animal loses heat. A creature the size of a crow has a great deal of surface for very little inside, and warmth escapes fast across that skin. A coat of fine filaments traps a still layer of air against the body and slows that loss. For a small feathered dinosaur in a cool, damp forest, such a coat would have earned its keep as insulation. Yutyrannus lived through a regional climate that appears to have been cooler than the steamy world people often imagine, which fits a large predator keeping some cover. Now scale the animal up. As a body grows, its volume climbs far faster than its surface. A full-grown Tyrannosaurus rex, several tons of muscle and bone, holds heat the way a boulder holds the afternoon sun long after dusk. Its problem is not staying warm. Its problem, more often, is shedding heat without cooking from the inside. Under that logic, a heavy coat becomes a liability rather than a comfort. The reconciling idea is that giant tyrannosaurid adults, living in warmer settings, may have reduced or lost their feathering as they grew, keeping bare-scaled skin instead. A downy hatchling, perhaps, growing into a mostly naked adult. It is a clean explanation, and it may well be right. But you should hold it at the correct distance. No one has yet lifted a full body of Tyrannosaurus rex from the ground, with its complete covering intact, feathered here and scaled there, mapped from head to tail. What we have are patches, a scale impression from one region of one animal, a filament coat on a smaller, older relative. The size and climate story is inference, a reasonable line drawn between scattered points, not a picture taken from a single preserved giant. Said plainly, the idea that the rex shed its feathers as it grew is a strong hypothesis wearing the clothes of a fact, and the two should not be confused. There is a second argument about the tyrannosaur face, and it has changed how many people now picture the animal at rest. It concerns lips. Not soft, muscular lips like yours, but scaly, reptilian ones. Thin sheets of skin that could hang down over the teeth and hide them when the mouth was closed. For a long time, the popular image ran the other way. The film monster grins with every tooth exposed, curved fangs standing permanently in open air, dry and gleaming. Ask yourself whether real teeth could survive that way. In 2023, a team of researchers set out to test the exposed grin against the tissue that teeth actually need. They did not find fossilized lips. Instead, they looked at 3 lines of clues. First, tooth wear. A tooth left hanging in the open air tends to wear and erode along its outer face in a particular pattern, the way a stone left proud of the soil weathers on its exposed side. Theropod teeth, they argued, did not show that signature of long air exposure. Second, enamel. Enamel stays healthy when it is kept moist, and it cracks and degrades when it dries. Covered teeth stay wet against the gum. Third, jaw anatomy and proportion. The spacing and length of the teeth against the size of the skull, compared across living reptiles that keep their teeth covered and those that leave them bare. They line tyrannosaurs and their kin up against that living comparison. Crocodiles carry their teeth out in the open, and their smiles are ragged, worn and irregular. Many lizards keep their teeth sheathed behind a lip of scaly skin. On the measures the team chose, big predatory theropods sat with the lizards, not the crocodiles. Their teeth, however long, seemed to fit inside a closed mouth. From that the conclusion followed. Tyrannosaurus most likely kept scaly lips drawn over its teeth at rest, and showed those blades only when the jaws opened to feed. A very different silhouette from the frozen snarl. Picture a mouth closed into a flat, dry line, the killing edges tucked away like knives in a drawer, revealed only in the moment they were used. That reconstruction has real support, and it has quietly reshaped a great deal of new paleoart. But notice where it stands. Every plank of the argument is a comparison, where patterns compared to living reptiles, enamel health compared to living reptiles, tooth and jaw proportion compared to living reptiles. What the study did not have, and what no one has yet pulled from the rock, is a preserved theropod lip. No fossil skin caught in the act of covering a tooth. It is an inference built from many careful measurements, strong, but standing one step back from the thing itself. A comparison, however good, is not the same as holding the tissue in your hand. So both of these questions remain genuinely open, and it is worth being clear about what would close them. For the coat, the answer is almost embarrassingly simple to state and cruelly hard to find. It is a single large tyrannosaurid, ideally a Tyrannosaurus rex, preserved with enough of its body surface intact to map the covering from nose to tail. Scales here, filaments there, or scales everywhere, read straight off one animal rather than stitched together from many. Such a specimen would settle in an afternoon what argument has circled for years. Until it surfaces, the giants keep some of their appearance to themselves. For the lips, the settling evidence is just as specific. It is direct preserved soft tissue, a scrap of scaly skin fossilized in its living place along the jaw, sealed over the teeth, clearly drawn back from them. That single fossil would turn a careful inference into an observation. And the ground has surprised us before, with feather filaments, with pigment, with the pressed shape of skin, so it is not foolish to keep hoping the rock still holds a face. If you want an honest ledger, it looks like this. On the lips, the weight of current analysis leans toward covered teeth, and the exposed permanent grin is now the harder position to defend. It is the better supported reading, though not the closed case. On the coat, the picture is thinner and more balanced. Yutyrannus proves that a heavy tyrannosaur could be feathered. Scale impressions prove that large tyrannosaurid skin could be bare. The bridge between them, that adults shed their cover as size and warmth made it needless, is plausible and popular and still unproven. 2 loops, then, left deliberately open, because the fossils that would tie them shut have not yet been dug. There is a discipline in leaving them open. It would be easy to pick the tidier story and speak it with confidence, to hand you a single face for the most famous predator that ever lived. But the evidence does not yet earn that certainty, and pretending otherwise would trade a true unknown for a false picture. So the tyrannosaur you carry in your mind should stay a little unfinished at the edges. Lips, most likely over hidden teeth. a coat that is anyone's careful guess, a creature known in its bones and still debated in its skin. What remains is a young science, still turning old certainties slowly over in its hands. What remains is a young science, still turning old certainties slowly over in its hands, and now the view begins to lift. You rise without hurry, away from the lamp and the acid dish, away from the narrow bench where a soft dark thread of something ancient waits in clear liquid. The quarry falls away beneath you. The hammers go quiet. That careful grid of string and flag shrinks to a pale patch on the hillside, and then to nothing at all. Below you, the present thins out. The rooms where bones become bodies grow small and warm and far away. You keep rising, and the roof of the world opens and time opens with it, folding back the way a long tide draws down off a beach. Now the land beneath you is no longer ours. It is green in ways our world has never been green. You are looking down on the Mesozoic and the air is thick and wet and warm. Let the images gather as you climb. There is the bone first, white and heavy in its bed of stone, the anchor of everything you have followed. Beside it lies the skin, its patterns of scale pressed clean into rock, finer at the joints where the animal once bent and flexed. There is the filament, soft as down along a small hunter's spine, and there is the pigment, ordered in grains too fine to see, holding a colour that outlasted the creature by tens of millions of years. You do not need to name them again, let them simply pass beneath you. There is the drying floodplain, low and humid at the close of the Cretaceous, its rivers brown and slow. A duck-billed body lies on the mud, skin sagging tight over the ribs the way a gourd shrinks around its seeds. The water is rising somewhere upstream. Soon it will come and press wet clay into every wrinkle and hold that shape for 66 million years. You watch the flood arrive from far above, silent, patient, and then you are already higher, and the floodplain is only a smear of silver and green. There is the ash-blanketed lake, further off, in an older world. Volcanoes breathe pale smoke along its distant shore. Feathered shapes move through the broken light beneath the canopy, dark above and soft below, their colour a quiet trick against the dappled forest floor. Ash settles over the water like the gentlest snow. It will bury them and keep them and carry their feathers to us across a great gulf of years. From up here it is only a grey veil drifting down, slow as a held breath. You keep rising. The great salt lagoon comes into view, still and bright and lifeless at its heart, the water too heavy with salt for anything to stir it. A single winged body sinks slowly through the clear column and settles into the lime mud without a ripple. In that stillness a feather will become a whisper of carbon in white stone. You see it happen once from a great height, and then the lagoon is a coin of light, and then it is gone behind you. Think of how far this land has travelled to reach us. Once there were only guesses stretched over a handful of bones, a thumb spike mistaken for a horn, an imagined beast crouched in a garden. Now there is evidence, layered and stubborn and real. The land below you holds all of it, the wrong guesses and the right ones side by side in the same patient rock. Now the animals themselves begin to shrink. The 1-ton predator, shaggy with simple filaments, is a moving speck at the tree line. The small striped hunter with the mask across its eyes is smaller still, a flicker at the water's edge. The 4-winged glider is a mote of grey and white and rust turning once in the sun. The scaled and downy grazer is only a shape among shapes now, feeding in a meadow you can no longer quite make out. They do not disappear, they simply grow distant, the way a figure on a platform grows distant as your train pulls slowly away. Higher again, and the forest become a single dark skin drawn over the land. The rivers become bright threads. The herds become drifting grain, scattered across the plains like seed thrown by a slow and easy hand. You cannot tell one from another now. You do not need to. They were here. The evidence is real and it is waiting in the rock, and that is enough to hold. Take one slow, deep breath and let the height carry you. Now the eras themselves begin to move. The warm wet green of one age gives way to another, and the coastlines shift and the mountains rise and wear down again like sandcastles under a returning tide. The continents drift together and apart far below you, pale and enormous and calm. Whole worlds of creatures come and go in the space of a single easy exhale. The grains that were herds settle into thin layers. The layers press down into stone. The stone lifts and folds and waits. From here, all of it is quiet. The heat and the noise and the fear, the hunt and the flood and the falling ash, all of it softens into bands of coloured rock, gold and rust and grey and green, stacked one gentle age upon the next. This is where they rest, not lost, held. Written into the ground in a language it took us a very long time to learn to read. You're high above it now, and the whole long record lies open beneath you like a map drawn in patient light. Somewhere down there a bone still carries the scar of a muscle. Somewhere a slab of stone still holds the outline of a feather. Somewhere a thin film of clay still keeps the shape of skin that dried in the sun before the water came. None of it is calling to you. It is only there, and it will stay there, and there is comfort in that. Let the animals fade away into the deep floor of time, into the bone and the skin and the filament and the last faithful grains of colour. They are safe there. They have been safe there all along, waiting through the dark for a lamp and a careful hand and a curious eye. There is no hurry in any of it. There never was. The light is low and kind. The land beneath you turns slowly, warm and dim and settled, holding its long sleep the way it has always held it, without fear and without end. There is nothing left for you to do here, nothing to watch for, nothing to answer. The old world keeps itself now, the way it has kept itself across more ages than you could ever count, quietly, faithfully folded into the stone. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let the view go soft at its edges. The green land drifts far below, unhurried, and you drift with it, easy and unafraid, carried on the slow current of all that deep and gentle time. The last of it dims, the continents turn, the record closes over, patient as ever, and holds. Sleep well tonight, traveller. Good night.